Um, well, welcome to our panelists and welcome to our audience. I think we're very lucky to have an international group of scholars today to study well, transnational fascism and the right. So many thanks really for being here to all of you, and many thanks to the audience as well. The Congress is sort of framed around two main ideas. The first one is transnational ideas of the right and how they circulate. And the second one is about geography, in the sense that we're going to concentrate mainly on Southern Europe, but we will also be having papers on Austria, we'll be having papers on Flanders, we're going to be having papers on South America. So in that sense, we'll be dealing with the so-called Latin space, but beyond as well. So these are sort of the main factors that we'll be dealing with over the next 2 days.
Thanks, Alex. I just had a couple of very practical points to what Alex has just said. The first is about plurilingualism. We have thought of this event as trilingual, so Italian, English, and Spanish. We assume, we hope that everybody or most people will be able to at least passively understand most of the time. Of course, there might be situations in which we will be a little bit lost in translation, but we can use our asymmetric and complementary linguistic skills maybe to help each other out. So please feel free to talk in any of these 3 languages, and hopefully everything will go very good throughout the day. Another practical thing, if you take a look at the program, we're going to have 3, let's say, more social moments today. We're going to have a coffee break between 11:45 and 12:15. We couldn't have catering here, so we go outside in a bar, and I would just ask you to, we have unfortunately a sailing, so I would ask you to order maybe a hot drink and a pastry, and that will be covered for the participants. We will discuss and speakers will be covered by the conference. Then we're going to have lunch, and for lunch I will just ask you to fill out this sheet, because the restaurant has asked us to order a little bit in advance, so there will be a speaker when we go there. So there is a menu, and then there is a table, and we just ask you to say whatever to indicate what you want. And then finally, tonight we are going for dinner. Again, this is covered by the conference for all the speakers and discussants. And only in the program it is indicated that it will be at 8, but actually it will be slightly later at 8:30. So you have some time to go back to your hotel for those who are here from abroad, or home if you live in Madrid. Or I'm quite sure there will be a group that will go for drinks. So you can see later who will go where. Finally, 2 points. If you are plan to show a presentation, use a PowerPoint, you should upload it on that computer with a USB key, and use that computer. And then the other point, since we are streaming the event, please make sure that the mic is on when you talk. I think that the technicians will indicate us if that's not the case. And for the Q&A as well, we need to use a microphone, so there will be somebody all the time taking the mic around, but just please wait to have the mic before talking. So without further ado, I think we can start with the first answer in you.
Yes. There's a panel, Fascisms on the Move. I think it's no exaggeration if I say that today I have two world-leading scholars of fascism and the right in Europe. And we have Giulia Albanese, professor of modern history at Padova University, an expert on Italian fascism and comparative fascism and the right, author of a number of books, among them March on Rome, bestseller in English, I believe, and recently translated into English. Dittature mediterranee, sovversione fascista e colpi di Stato in Italia, Spagna e Portogallo, also as an editor di fascismo italiano, storia e interpretazione, and one of her latest books in English it was In the Society, which is Acclamation, Acquiescence, an agency in Mussolini's Italy. Together with Professor Albanese, we have Professor Aristotle Kallis, Professor of Modern European History at Keele University in the UK. Among his books, Genocide and Fascism, Nazi Propaganda in the Second World War, and Rethinking Fascism and Dictatorship in Europe, an edited book with Antonio Costa Pinto, who will be joining us later today. The way we thought about this panel was sort of it's divided into two parts. The first one is going to be sort of a short talk by both panelists, and then basically we'll have this as a discussion. So, you go first? Okay.
Here we are. I would like to thank the organizer of this conference, which brings together many friends and colleagues with whom I'm very happy to discuss in these 2 days. And I'm sorry for my English, which we choose that it is better to speak in the same language, but you will see I will do many errors. Okay. I think that in many ways we can say that the March on Rome set the stage for the wide issues that we'll be discussing today, and especially the relationship between fascism and conservatism and the transnational dimension of these ideologies in the interwar period. Even if historiography made some effort both in discussing this event as in the national history of fascism and in its transnational impact throughout Europe. Already defining the March on Rome brings us to the relationship between fascism and conservatism. In fact, what did the march amount to? A coup d'etat, an act of psychological warfare, an insurrection, a mise-en-scène, a revolution, a counter-revolution. Answering these questions, to me, has consequences in the ways in which we consider the relationship between fascism and conservatism, and even more if we answer to this question as I would do, saying that the March on Rome was all these things together. And one of the problems in interpreting this event was exactly the fact that the difficulty of holding all these elements together, but also the exceptionality of this event create problems in defining in which categories we can speak about the March on Rome, create very different interpretations of the consequences of the event and how it had an impact both in Italy and at the transnational level. I won't dwell much on this issue of the interpretation of the march, which I will be happy to go deeper or to speak deeper on it later. But I think that this really was an element which prevent also the acquisition and the reflection on the event. But I would like to underline that this was a substantial element of the success and of a substantial part of the possibility of the circulation of the imagination around the March on Rome throughout Europe and beyond. In October 1922, the March on Rome was not envisaged as a solution, as something, as a transnational or as something which had to do with a transnational or an international impact, but was envisaged as a solution to a domestic political conflict. There was no ambition to present this event as a political model for the transformation of liberal regimes throughout Europe and beyond. Nonetheless, this event gripped the attention of contemporaries, both in the left and in the right, and it was immediately clear that, and I mean, I would say it is increasingly evident that this event had a huge impact in the way politics and revolution and counter-revolution was thought at the time. I think it was a watershed in the political history of Europe, even if, as I already said, historiography made some effort and is still struggling with putting it at the role it deserves. And here I would indicate one of the first problems that I think we could discuss about this event. And it is if the attention and impact that the March on Rome had on contemporaries throughout Europe was the effect of already existing right-wing or nationalist or whatever you can, whatever you define them, networks who recognized in this event something that had already to do with the discourses that were already present on the political scene, or, as I believe, if it was able to transform, change, and develop new political networks and new political discourses. I think that answering this question in a way or in another changes in a deep way the way in which we conceive fascism and in which we conceive the political history of the 1920s and the 1930s. Today in the morning we were talking with Annalisa Gori, Annarita Gori, of the fact that there was another event that had similar impact and potential of transformation for me, because if the moral ideas, etc., then we can argue that fascism was not such a deep novelty in the political scene, and that in a way it was already present, or it was to be present, in any case, independently from the historical experience of Italian fascism in the 20s and 30s. But if we think, as I think, that the scene was deeply transformed by this event and by the way in which Benito Mussolini and his men transformed Italy and the political scene of both at the national and international way, we have, then we cannot think to the transnational dimension of fascism without speaking and thinking to the national dimension of what Italian fascism, and the two is the historical dimension of what Italian fascism was. And I think that this is a fundamental issue also in the way we think to transnational fascism in the historiography. And this is, and in a way, what I mean is that these transnational networks were not generic transnational networks, but were transnational networks which were transformed by the historical experience of Italian fascism, which doesn't mean, obviously, that this transformation was the same in every place, and which doesn't mean that this transformation bring to the same transformation in every single nation and in every single aspect of the political development of the time. Nonetheless, if we don't consider this historical experience, I think we can't fully understand the way in which other experience of fascism were modeled and were thought. Nonetheless, the diffusion of ideas coming from the March on Rome, the way in which fascists transform Italy, etc., could also be sustained by networks that were already existing. So at the same time, the March on Rome and this event and the way in which it was perceived created new political networks at the transnational level, but was sustained by the fact that there already were transnational networks, for example, nationalist networks and conservative networks, which in a way immediately which were already activated and which continued to be so even within this political novelty. And this is the reason for I think that it is very important to consider, which I want to do it, but we could do later if needed, how the first news about the March on Rome and what was happening in Italy were diffused, which were the first reaction, which was the role of prejudice and stereotypes on what was Italy, playing a role in the way in which this impact was considered. And it is very interesting to me that these first meaningful reactions and some of the most meaningful reactions to the March on Rome were particularly strong in countries like Spain, Portugal, and Germany, which were struggling with their liberal systems, which were not eager or which were not happy with this system, and which were searching for a solution to the problem and the relationship between society, the institution, the issues of democratization that were present at the time. They were struggling with this problem, and the March on Rome represented to many intellectuals, especially on the right-wing spectrum, as a lesson, as a model, as a pattern of transformation of the political scene. A pattern, that in a way showed that the authoritarian and dictatorial perspective could be put back at the center of the scene of political modernity. That it was not something that had to do with the past, but that was something that immediately brought this perspective back to the modernity, to modernity, to political modernity. Which obviously tell us that we have at the same time a counter-revolutionary model and a revolutionary one. And which obviously it wasn't received easily or interpreted easily when it was used as a model. And both the example of Primo de Rivera on one side and Adolf Hitler and his Munich coup on the other show that in the way in which this model or this image of the March on Rome and the seizure of power by fascists was interpreted and considered and reenacted, or was alive in the way in which other political experience of transformation of the political scene were considered. Nonetheless, it is clear that, for example, starting from the 20s, in many political situation abroad, and especially where the liberal regimes were tottering or inadequate, etc., the search, for example, from the part of the press of a local Mussolini was widespread. So Adolf Hitler was considered a local Mussolini, Primo de Rivera was considered, but there are many, many examples. As there are many examples, both in the 20s and in the 30s, of political events modeled in very different way on the image of the March on Rome. March on capitals were developed in Portugal, the March on Lisbon in 26, in Vienna in 31, in Finland, and also events, relevant event of the right-wing conflicts, both in Paris in 34 and in London in 36, had resonated with the event of the March on Rome. Even if, in many ways, and many of these events had a tenuous relationship with the historical event of March on Rome, but they had a strong relationship with the image of this march and to all that was created by the transformation that the March on Rome brought to the March on, to the political discourse of the time. And this is very interesting because if we look at how Italian liberals looked at the March on Rome, not creating discontinuity in the evolution of the liberal state in Italy. There are jurists that continued to say in the 20s, in the 30s, in the 40s, and in the 50s that since the statute, the Albertine Statute, so the Constitution of Italy, wasn't changed until the 1st of January 1946, sorry, but then we can say that there was an institutional continuity which is clearly nonsense. The other thing that it is interesting to consider in this discussion, and I'm finishing, it's the fact that is to think at the way in which fascism did or did not promote this his experience as an international and transnational experience. And what we can say is that there was, as the March on Rome was thought as a national solution to a national problem, the March on Rome was not presented by the fascists abroad as a model. So we don't have an effort from Italy to promote this event, nor to promote Italian fascism until some years after. And for example, also the idea of creating a fascist international was not accepted by the central, the fascist ruling class until the 30s, actually. Even if it was present among fascist intellectuals, but well before the 30s. Already in the mid-20s, there were people trying to promote and push Mussolini toward this move. Nonetheless, we can also say that for sure Italian immigrants outside Italy were thinking to promote this experience and this political model abroad. We can say that they were among those who promoted also in the Mussolinian circle the idea that an international and fascist international could be promoted. And we can also say that part of the unofficial Italian promotion of fascism in the 20s was realized by intellectuals which were near to Mussolini and which were trying to address the issue of how fascism could change the political scene in Europe, and what was the reason of the fortune of the figure of Mussolini, or to promote the figure of Mussolini abroad. As I'm thinking, as an example, to intellectual like Prezzolini, who was writing a history of fascism already in the mid-20s, which was well circulated in Europe, and especially to the biography of Benito Mussolini, written by his lover and how can I say, Consular Margherita Sarfatti Dux, which had an enormous success and which was bringing images of Mussolini abroad and promoting this idea. So, and was near enough to Mussolini to make us think that the problem of diffusing fascism abroad was not completely alien to the leader of fascism, although there weren't institutional and national, there weren't Italian institutions promoting this diffusion, but it was his men or women who were trying to diffuse this idea. I will finish to speak with the two last issues, and one is why the March on Rome was so successful in interwar Europe, and I'm obviously available to try to demonstrate that it was successful if you don't believe it. And this is because it was at the same time revolutionary and conservative, because it showed that the transformation of institution could be realized also with a legitimation from above, promoting a principle of order and promoting continuity through discontinuity. And the other thing is that it promoted a new form of ritualism and mass politics without altering the social, political, and economic hierarchies, which was something that was searched for. At the same time, what is interesting is that fascism cast, not immediately, but pretty soon, Italy in a new light. And I think this is very important for the success Italian fascism enjoyed, especially in countries that weren't at the center of the international networks. Because at the same time, Italy was a growing or a developing country which was starting to be set at the center of the political, of the international political arena. And fascism was, in a way, underlying this role and its possibility to be in this situation. And also through discourses around the Vittoria Mutilata, etc., promoting a nationalist and a rebirth of Italy as a power country, with the fact that it was not strong on an international set. And it offered hope to recently formed states that aspire to improve their standard on the international stage, which saw Italy as a young country which in recent decades had undergone significant development, and hence as an example that could be followed. In this way, I can say that fascism presented itself as a new political movement capable of offering answers to the political elite and impoverished middle class, but also to the church authorities and to those Catholics who were alarmed by liberalism and even more by socialism. And they showed that even within the sphere of political modernity, certain models were available that might ensure the preservation of order and the integration of masses within an authoritarian and traditional context. That's it.
Thank you, Julia. Fantastic.
We just
yeah. Professor Callis, well,
is this working?
I think you have to press it.
I think you have to push it and no, it's just then, because none of them turn on.
Oh, it's not working.
This is working.
No.
Okay, I'll use this one then, and I have to warn you, I will get quite animated, especially because I have to fit everything in a short period of time. We did these two initial presentations independently. To me, it looks like we have been working together for like 3 hours, because there are a lot of overlaps, which is great for a talk like this. So whenever I encounter overlaps in my notes, I'll skip them and just connect to what Julia sent for an event in Madrid, for an event as a meeting of people who have spent quite a considerable part of their lives working on this damned topic. I start from the official name of this panel, which I think Julia did, but you'll come back
in my talk quite a bit of sort of fascism on the move. And I don't want to get really linguistic about it, but I would say that we can probably reflect a little bit and not take it for granted. So my initial observation, and I'm really going to race through because I don't want to go more than a few minutes, that the success, into inverted commas, of fascism was in many ways a surprise. It was a surprise in Italy. I mean, a radical startup in 1919, it wasn't doing very well. I know I'm treading on Giulia's path here, but you know, the second half of 1919 and the first half of 1920 was a no man's land in many ways, but it became a spectacular success. To me, the two more interesting successes, if you like, is the transnational impact beyond Italy, but, and this is the one I feel more strongly, it was the diffusion away from the usual suspects, transnationally again. The young, angry male radicals, disaffected, and so on, the stereotype of the fringe of the ultra-nationalist right. So how fascism affects, and I'll talk about this in a moment, much broader and actually quite different, radically different constituencies. Not only in Italy, but also abroad. And the reason why I am mentioning this is because, and I'll make this clear, but I'll keep repeating it. When we're talking about diffusion of ideas, and that is again one of those terms that we can debate for a day, okay? But let's take it for what it is. Diffusion involves two kinds of jumps. One of them is jumping the national border, which means a different cultural, historical context. But there are other jumps, and I think fascism is an example in that respect, which is a jump from the initial constituency, let's say the paradigmatic constituency in Italy, the early fascists, to much broader constituencies who, against the odds, find what is happening in Italy quite interesting and relevant to their own experiences, not only to the experiences of their countries, but also to the experiences of their own political project. And in the case of authoritarians, for example, that's a very different political project. So to me, that is the mystery. It's not so much why a Morassian, disaffected intellectual gets interested in what's happening in Italy. Of course it's interesting and important, absolutely. But why does a conservative, mainstream authoritarian, deeply wedded in traditional values, gets interested into this? Giulia made a point which makes it easier for me, the sort of idea that fascism was on the move in spite of the fascists. And I think this is something important that I'm going to use in a moment to talk about something that is quite important with what I'm saying in that respect. So talking about fascism on the move involves a number of components. It's no surprise, it's a very complex process. It involves the source, whatever that source might be. We're talking about Italy here, but the sources proliferate, of course. Germany, I would argue very strongly, Portugal, and many others. The source, the local agent who engages with that idea, and a number of other things, such as the reception, the attitude. And again, Giulia touched on this, that these people came into this with different ideas. A few general ideas, and then I'm going to go and give you an example. When we talk about new ideas or new things, these new ideas and new things have a disadvantage. They come into a field that is already populated. So one of the ways to describe fascism is we call it a latecomer. Juan Linz did. The latecomers somehow succeeded. And how do new ideas, they have to do extra work, so they have to think about how they pitch their message. how they frame their message, how they connect their message to existing beliefs, okay? So they do their job in that respect. But of course, it involves the other important component, which is the actor. So what happens when somebody engages with the idea, somebody engages with the source? And I would say that the actors are very important in this process. Not least, and I don't think that Julia used that word, but he said a similar thing. I think the actor constructs what is being observed. So the March on Rome, for us historians, is a historical event, a fact, one way or another, but Julia was talking about, I'm picking up the final points, was both revolutionary and counter-revolutionary, was both leading to a radical mass movement that would make a complete rupture, and a dictatorial regime that was also quite different. I would argue that the March on Rome of fascism, because I'm not talking about March on Rome, was or was not something like this, but it was perceived, and that is equally important. So for me, the local actor constructs what is being observed. They don't just observe it. Remember how we started this discussion of diffusion some decades ago. We were talking about fascists as this process as imitation, as infection. We took all agency out of the people on the other side. That's what we're trying to give them back, that kind of agency. So the actor, far away, decides that what's happening in Italy or anywhere else, whether it's the march or whatever, is interesting. That's the first stage. They engage with it a bit more. Then they may come to they may reject it, or they may come to a decision that it is potentially relevant. Okay, so that's a deeper level of engagement. Potentially relevant means what? It means, and Julia spoke about this one, the March on Rome was coming from Italy. There were all stereotypes about Italy. A large part of the initial reception was that, as you said, it was an Italian solution to an Italian problem. Great solution, but it can't be translated to other countries. So the local actors negotiate the difference. This is something that was created in a different context by different people, but it's interesting and potentially relevant. How do I translate it into something different? And at that point, I think that the actor is emancipated from the source. They become much more active. Not only do they see, but they interpret and they reconstruct the source. And I would say that they reconstruct it as a revolutionary or as a counter-revolutionary event in that respect. Allow me, for my last bit, to talk to you. I hope that was for me.
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Allow me to talk to you about a case study that I would say, on the basis of the introduction, would fit the description, although it wasn't mentioned. So a case study that never features in those cases, and I'm talking about Greece, where I was born, and I know you didn't invite it, but to me it's quite interesting. Just very, very briefly. 1922, the March on Rome in Greece, no impact whatsoever. Not even mentioned in the news. There is a reason for it. The Greek army had just been defeated in Asia Minor. So in order to engage with something, you need to have the luxury of actually looking around for something to engage with. They washed it by. It was completely out. From 1924-25, we get people who see Mussolini as a model. I'm not going to get you into names, but to me the interesting thing about the Greek case is that these are not only mainstream thinkers and politicians and actors, they are systemic, and they see fascism as a solution for the government to crush the opposition. Not even the left, the other side. There's a big polarization in Greece between two sides. If you want questions, you don't, but I'm just saying I could get into details, but that's the thing. So they see it as a systemic solution already. Fast forward, 1934, long way ahead. A Greek newspaper invites a number of conservative politicians and liberal politicians to ask a question. Democracy or dictatorship? And for about 7 days, the first page of the newspaper, canonical newspaper, okay, like Corriere della Sera in Italy, the equivalent, all sorts of people create this. Even people who come from the liberal establishment and they think that parliamentary democracy is a good thing and dictatorship is not a good thing. They say, but when we have a crisis, when there is emergency, dictatorship could be an important or necessary solution. And then they use Mussolini as, and you made that point later on, the beginning of a new type of dictatorship. To me, what's more interesting is they go through and create a whole list of references. And they mention Ataturk in Turkey, Stojadinovic in Serbia, Dollfuss, just about to be assassinated in Austria, less Hitler, and Primo de Rivera. Primo de Rivera is in fact one of the, Salazar, obviously, Primo de Rivera. Primo de Rivera, Miguel, not Jose Antonio, is a very important name there. Now, I know I am in very good company here, and I will not impart with you my charlatan knowledge of what's happening in Spain in the 1920s. But consider this genealogy, and the word fascism comes up as part of this discussion. This genealogy of fascist rogues, nobody would actually, none of us would create that genealogy today. You know, let's trace the history. Does it matter? Of course it does. But to me, it matters that these people saw that these phenomena create a continuity and a new type of a movement in that respect. I'm going to finish with this observation. It takes two to diffuse. The source is important. The agency of the prototypes are important. We are in the process of giving back agency to the actors, to the local actors. I think we can do more. We can trace the patterns of circulation. Julia spoke a lot, and again, I don't have to, about networks. Of course, it's not just individuals. It's already existing networks. They come to this with their prior assumptions. There's no other way. I can't expect Primo de Rivera in Spain to be excited about fascism's revolutionary potential. Absolutely not. But I'm really intrigued by the fact that somebody like him finds in fascism in 1923, when you put your money on something that hasn't been tested, okay, something exciting. And of course, then you go to Rome and so on and so forth. So I'm trying to make the case that the actor who observes, interprets, is also emancipated from what they see. And we need to keep that in mind in order to understand how these ideas, and in our case fascism, gets, as it were, diffused around. Actors are active constructors with their own perceptions, with their own frames of the source. They create genealogies, they create paths, and they shape what they see into what they want to achieve, which sometimes can be a revolutionary project, but sometimes can be an authoritarian, conservative, order-affirming project in that respect. Fascism is part of both stories.
Thank you.
So let me just check how we're doing in terms of time. I think this work doesn't? Yeah, if I approach it. Well, thanks a lot, because it's really interesting the way you both have actually got into the idea of the networks and how ideas circulate, and actually providing some agency to the reader or the local actor when it comes to get these ideas. I would like to comment on this sort of last point, in the sense that it's a sort of a comment and as well a question. I don't know whether we know much about, I mean, we know quite a lot about sort of formal and informal networks of intellectuals and politicians sort of writing about fascism and communicating across Europe and as well the Americas, and sort of reflecting with information that was coming from Italy initially. And that has been sort of traced both in terms of those formal and informal networks. But I was thinking as well about, and that's why I think Professor Callis's point was very good at the end, about the reception by those local actors that were not intellectuals, that were sort of, I don't know whether it's called sort of just conservative citizens. They were probably not even politicians, that they could actually read fascism, or at least what was going on in 22, 23, 24, 25 in Italy, as something that, so just not, let me put it this way, not reading Mussolini writings, or not having any sort of contact with any Italian, but just reading the newspaper, which is basically the main source there. How this actually facilitated a manner to understand the break with a liberal system, whether as in Spain or in Portugal, or for that matter at the time or later in the case, well, actually no, in the case of Greece as well, in a fairly acceptable manner, within that sort of mental framework in which these people operated. Fascism was, in a way, because of that dual sort of revolutionary but counter-revolutionary features, whether it might sort of easier for many conservatives in Europe to accept that that change was possible, that, okay, breaking with the liberal parliamentary systems was not that dramatic, and it could be done without going into big crisis. In that sense, that it was good enough to stop, let me put it this way, bluntly, it was good enough to stop the left, but it didn't imply a proper revolution.
Is this for both? Is this
well, yeah. I mean, it's.
Do you want me to go, and then I can go, and then you can go? Thank you very much. I think that is a very important channel of not only dissemination of news about fascism and what's happening in other countries, it's a channel of framing the perception of it. It's understandable that we are attracted to the intellectual networks and the highbrow political networks, but you're right. Newspapers, which is a very important mediator in this whole process, and I use that word deliberately. Bruno Latour makes that frame it, they change it, they comment it, and then they make it available to new audiences. And as you say correctly, that becomes the window for a large number of people to what is happening in Italy, or to what is happening in other countries. And I think what's really interesting here, and I'd written it, but I never mentioned it, one way of talking about reception of new ideas is to talk about what Hannah Arendt was mentioning as fertile soil. Okay, you know, the idea can be as good as any, but that doesn't mean that it's going to be successful. You need a fertile soil. And I know it's a bit schematic and so on, but just indulge me for a second. What kind of fertile soil was that? Well, I mean, post-World War I, there is already quite a disoriented transnational public there. That's a broad way of thinking. But it's not even post-World War I. It's even before World War I that there's already a dissident political space that is looking for alternatives to the liberal order, a way to crush the left. They're fed up with a neutral state. They're trying to get an assertive national state that is going to stand up for their interests. And then, of course, come Versailles, their minority protections, the Jewish emancipation clauses and everything. So there is already a fertile soil. It's a very mixed group transnationally as well as within the same country. Sure. But they're united by the shared negations. They know what they can't stand. They don't know where they want to go necessarily, but they know they don't want what's happening now. What's happening now is existentially devastating to them. So this is what creates the possibility of the latch. And I think, and I finish with this, the reason why I'm mentioning the Greek case is because I've been working the last year about this period in the 1920s, but the first mention of the fascists, who are called fascisti, just to create a sort of difference, in Greek, that is in 1921 by a newspaper on the fringes of the mainstream right, so not hugely radical, and it says, look at what the fascisti are doing. We need the same thing, the spirit of national renaissance, to fight against the Turks. That's already a massive jump compared to what was happening in Italy. No socialist, no liberal system, nothing at all. Later on, in 23, the first references come, oh, here is potentially a solution to this. This is what begins that process of a lot of people engaging. It's already a heavily mediated process through what newspapers, and you're right, that's very important, but also some rogue figures put into the process.
I agree with Aristotle and to the many things he said about this issue. I would add something about these disseminators and mediators, to whom the circulation of the news about Italy and the March on Rome were asked. There weren't just local journalists. Italians were often asked to comment this. I remember that, for example, in Portugal, there was this doctor who was asked to comment. It was an Italian Jewish doctor, by the way, Venetian Jewish doctor. So you have figures that are present in the different places and that are Italian, and they are asked to comment or to provide interpretation of the fact. There are these people searching for alternatives and not finding them until that moment. And these people are on many sides, as it was said. So there are Catholics that are looking at Italy. There are conservatives. There are people searching for a revolutionary right-wing move. And these are commenting at the same time, or there are left-wing left-wing people that are how do you say, that are taking distances from their previous ideas in the same moment. So I think that this constellation of actors mediating the ideas of fascism is very important, also to produce this, not only to address, but also to produce this fertile soil in which all these ideas are connected. And I think that this should looked at. And also at the moment I'm trying to work on the books produced on Italian fascism abroad, which are often related to the newspaper, because in some cases there are inquiries that are collected and published in books after having been in newspapers. By journalists, etc. And it's very interesting to see how translation from Italian intellectuals, politicians, etc., and local production of discourses around Italian fascism intertwines or not. Which are the themes that are proposed in some of these publications and in others, which are the spots that are under the light or are not under the light already about the Italy of 1922, 1923, 1924, in an Italy with that Italian historians, even now, I would say, are not able to recognize as a country in which huge transformation, also in the way you present politics or you do politics, has undergone. Foreign observers, for example, looked at the way in which the first anniversary of the March on Rome is performed in Italy with mass demonstration. It's 1923. Italians are not able to see this novelty, and foreign observers that are in Italy or that are coming in Italy that want to meet Mussolini because they see that Mussolini is modifying the picture, are there and are telling us what happened and why it is completely different from the politics they experienced until this moment. And this is something that not even Italian can see, and that also historiography now has many difficulties in looking at the mass dimension of fascism already in 22, 23, and 24.
Thank you. Yeah, I think if you have the sort of the right correspondence and you know the gaze in a way from abroad in many respects, actually it is I mean it's also mediated, and is mediating for whatever Germans or for Spaniards or for Portuguese, but as well sometimes the reading from abroad from this correspondence, if they're good, they can be actually very, very illuminating in many respects. Because they may see things that people in Italy wouldn't realize at the time. I think this is probably a good moment to open the floor and to go for questions. Peter Anderson, and then Tim Kirk, and then Morton. All right. Okay, so we have three in. I don't know, it would be better to sort of collect them in three. So yeah, Peter, Tim, and Morton, if you want, and then Peter.
Yeah, thank you to both speakers. Really fascinating talks. I've got a question about mediation. So a lot of the groups that you were talking about were kind of fascist groups or conservative groups, but I'm really quite interested in which they start to defascist transnational females. So yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
For Julia, first of all, and I think partly you answered this question when you commented on Alex's comments. Thank you both for very stimulating papers. I just think you say it was a watershed in European history. I think you answered that partly in terms of what happened between 22 and 25 was transformative in Italy, and that was observed. But I know, what do you think Europeans think happened, and how much do you think their attention was focused on it rather than the Irish Civil War, the Russian Civil War, the Russian Revolution and its consequences and so on? And then I was going to say what actually had happened in October 1922. You know, it was, as a mise en scène, it was kind of very chaotic. And the first question is related to the point that Aristotle made about Greece, which was distracted by the events in Asia Minor. And I think you said that the perception was more important. But I just wonder, when Mussolini and the March on Rome made an impact on Greece, it was 10 years later, more than 10 years later. So I wonder if you have the rapid invention of a tradition, but not very much at the time.
Thank you, and also from me, I think the two papers were very interesting, and I don't know if it's a question or a comment to Julia's excellent paper, but you talked about the old discussion about the Albertine Constitution and whether that one was suspended or not during the Ventennio, and whether the king eventually invoked the same constitution in 43 when Mussolini was put out of the game. In my view, this situation that you describe in 1922 was partly foreseen by Italian jurists before World War I. I'm referring to the great legal mind, perhaps the greatest legal mind in Italian jurisprudence, Santi Romano, who's not very well known among Italians, hardly published anywhere, difficult to find books, articles about him, who foresaw that in the future legal system, in a famous book that he called L'ordinamento giuridico, that legal system could coexist, that social groups could carve out their own juridical space, and that juridical space could coexist with existing laws. So actually, in my view, the situation which was created with the March on Rome was actually foreseen to a large extent by one of the greatest legal minds of Italian jurisprudence. The other question, which I think was very interesting, you talk about networks and also that it did not initially was sort of as an international phenomenon or ideology. But I'm always thinking about, if we look at what happened the year before, in 1921, at Livorno, the constitution of the Communist Party in Italy, and the fact that there, if my memory doesn't fail me, there were also representatives from Moscow at the event. Somehow, fascism must have taken good notice of the fact that the enemy, or one of them, was radically different in nature and internationalist. And I just want to ask you, because I'm very interested in this aspect, are there studies which are sort of examining a correlation, a contamination across from what happened at Livorno and to the way fascism gradually began to think of itself as having an international or internationalist potential in a way? Yeah.
I will try to answer in order. And anti-fascism. So, Italian anti-fascists weren't fully aware of what happened during the March on Rome until some years after. This, in a way, I mean, there are plenty of anecdotes I could quote about the fact that the socialists were thinking that nothing was changing, communists commenting on the continuity between the oppression of the liberal institution and the fascist, etc. I mean, this is, and actually on the leadership side, the ruling classes of most of anti-fascist group, the perception that things changed happened afterwards, between 24, 25, and this is one of the reasons for even after the end of the Second World War, there was some difficulties in perceiving and the role of the March on Rome in the change and in the transformation of the country. This certainly affected also the ways in which future anti-fascists abroad perceived the March on Rome and its role in transforming Europe. And I have the impression that while, for example, while on the right side and on the conservative side and on the side of those who weren't happy with the political panorama of the time, there was this attention and this feeling that the March on Rome was changing the field. This wasn't so strong on the other side. So this is, I would say, the general question, and I have also the impression that also on the women's side, the attention to what was happening in Italy was stronger on the right-wing and conservative side. I find many works, for example, of British women working or reading or telling what was Italian fascism on the fascist side, more strong on this side than on the anti-fascist side in the early years. I'm speaking just of the very early years after fascism. Even if from 34 and 35 it was communists especially that considered and created discourse about an international diffusion of the fascist experience abroad, which was very strong and also affected also historiography after the 45. That is, for example, one of the first historiographical reflection on the, in Italy on the diffusion of fascism abroad and on fascism came from Enzo Collotti, who was certainly reflecting on Third Internationalist view of fascism, etc. And also, I see that I think that the mass of studies on fascism in plural and on transnational fascism, etc., developing after the 90s has some connection to the fact that international that moment, this issue of a transnational and international dimension of fascism was a third internationalist issue and not an issue which was raised on the general public. So these are some ideas, but I should certainly work more on this side. for team. I'm sure that there were many other events of these years that were as important or more important sometimes than the March on Rome, and that in a way changed the way in which politics was conceived and reframed. Nonetheless, what it is very interesting to me is the fact that an event coming from Italy, a very marginal country in the international scene, had such an important effect. And for sure, this effect was also created and determined by the fact that there had been the Bolshevik Revolution, or that other events were happening. But nonetheless, it seems to me that this success is astonishing, and it should be reflected upon more than for a long time it has been. Even when it is an invention of tradition, as you said, in the 30s and 40s, even when this genealogy is reconstructed, not in the early 20s, is reconstructed in the late 20s, in the early 30s, or in the late 30s, or elsewhere. So. I mean, what is very important? It is very important to me is that, and this is something we discussed very much with Aristotle, that I agree completely with the fact that local actors recreated an idea of fascism, but you can fully understand what it is recreated if you are aware of the way in which this message is produced in the place in which it's produced. And I have the impression that sometimes the studies and the historiography on transnational fascism, on generic fascism, and on fascism networks overlook completely what happened or what was happening in that precise moment in Italy. And this risk to, in a way, cancel or to reduce the comprehension of the possibilities of reception and of the originality of reception. Because if you don't know what was happening where the initial idea was created, you cannot even understand how original and to which point this is the transformation is original. I agree with what Morten said in general and as a frame. Both on the juridical discourse, which is very important also to understand to what extent also on the institutional side the novelty of fascism could be received, etc. But I think that about the second issues raised, I think that what we have to do now, and the questions that were done indicate that this is very important, is exactly to try to connect networks, discourses, imagination of right-wing and conservative words, and networks, discourses and imagination of left-wing words. What I'm meaning is that both fascism and anti-fascism have been studied in very separated way, both at the national and at the international level. Even if, and although, these movements were at the same time creating their own path, but answering to what was happening in the other field in the same moment. And I have the impression that, and this is certainly sure for the Italian case, the perception and the understanding of this dialogue is almost completely absent, both in the research on fascism and on the research on anti-fascism, although there are exceptions. For example, I can quote a recent book by, not so recent, but quite recent book of Marco Bresciani on Giustizia e Libertà and the way in which they frame their discourse on anti-fascism, which engaged with the dialogue between fascism and anti-fascism. But I can say, for example, with regard to the perception of Italian fascism in Britain, that the way in which Gaetano Salvemini framed his anti-fascist propaganda and his discourse against fascism in Great Britain in the 20s and early 30s has never been studied in its dialogue with what was doing at the time another Italian, Luigi Villari, who was framing a pro-fascist propaganda, which was, I mean, the two discourses were in dialogue one with the other, but the historiography kept them at a distance and in a way without looking how they were dialoguing. So this is to say, I have not many answers to what you asked, but I think that this is really a step forwards to our understanding of fascism and anti-fascism that we should, in a way, develop.
Great. I mean, I don't need to say too much, I think, because that may allow a little bit of space. An additional point to the problem of constructing, of generating a strong anti-fascist transnational current, if you like, in the early years, to me has to do with the fact that, and you may disagree with me about this one, but I echo an unlikely source whose understanding of fascism I don't necessarily agree with, but Wilhelm Reich, in his interpretation of the psychology of fascism, makes the point that the fascists, talking about fascists and anti-fascists, and in that case particularly the left, said the fascists had an advantage because their message was more attuned to the banal familiarities of many people. So he makes the point that the program, and I think Julia is 100% right, the communist left provided the first understanding of fascism as an international problem, even if it was a political problem rather than a social movement problem in that respect. But the way in which this was pitched, Reich says, was far more, not only better, it's not about being better, it's an easier job to convince somebody that the nation is the ultimate priority rather than to go the other way around. And I can also reflect on George Moe's idea of the Nazis and the bourgeois respectability, that actually it was something that didn't speak the language of rupture with what people thought. The risk between the two discourses years is very fast, the sort of construction and so on and so forth. It's this kind of is so fascinating. You can align it with Salazar. I mean, sorry, only if there is no question from below. But please do ask it, otherwise mine's not very
I mean, the only thing is that we are supposed to finish
out of time. I can be in conversation with Julia over coffee.
We're supposed to finish as in 1 minute. So,
yeah, okay. That's fine.
I'm not sure whether perhaps a final question, if there's something from... Otherwise,
Coffee. No, it's okay. I don't want to keep people from... Okay, well, you spoke about we need to understand not only how it was perceived, but what happened on the source. And I totally agree. I mean, I use the populist phrase, it takes two, in that respect. But I would say my instinctive reaction is probably the construction is more important than the source. Am I reading in what you said something more than the obvious, which is that in order to construct something, you need to get to grips with what is actually happening in order to make some sense of it and then take it in any direction? Or is it something else? Because my response to what you said would be the reception is more important than actually the event.
No, I don't think that the reception is more important than the event.
I called it for it.
Yeah. No, I think that it is as important as, and that means that you have to know what is happening and how and where the differences are framed. Because also when you read what Italian fascists were saying about Italian fascism abroad, they are cutting things, and they are using only the things that they think they are useful to diffuse their messages abroad. And the things that Italians cut are very different from the things foreigners cut. Mm? For example, as I say, nobody in Italy underlined the fact that in 23 there were mass demonstrations for the anniversary of the March on Rome. That means that what Italians couldn't see was the mass dimension of fascism and of its politics already in 22-23. Mm? That was there. And this was the novelty of fascism. And this was what made fascists revolutionary, because on the other side, they didn't close the parliament was the same. They didn't bring the new election was the same. Primo de Rivera, Spain in 23 was much more revolutionary than Italy, sure. You can say. Yeah. Yeah? But nonetheless, the revolution, what was revolutionary in the eyes of everybody else was Italy. And why it was so? It was so because there were masses. So then, from then they moved on in their direction. But what was happening was real and was important, even when it wasn't conceived or understood by this part of the same actors.
Well, thank you very much. Actually, this was food for thought for real. We'll see you in half an hour then, back here with the next panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay. For lunch.
We have to send the choices to the restaurant. So here we have the starters and then the main course. Yeah. So choose one. You can also do 2 starters if you want. Just choose one for each and write it in the table.
Okay.
So, primero o secondo?
Yeah. O tu primeros.
Yeah. No. Okay.
Let's say the standard one.
Thank you.
Yo creo que se podrá pedir.
Oh, just have one thing. I mean, I don't want to have a big lunch.
Yo era un poco por no llevarme las cosas.
Hola, hola, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Prueba, 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 prueba. Hola, hola, hola. Ey, 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 ey. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Vale.
En el Congreso que quieran recibir el diploma acreditativo, por favor que firmen para la asistencia que está ahí fuera, que firmen la asistencia, muy sencillo. Y nada, pues es un gusto, voy a presentar muy rápidamente a las tres ponentes de esta mesa. Las voy a citar por su orden de intervención. En primer lugar, dar la bienvenida a Narita Gori. Viene del Instituto de Ciencias Sociales de Lisboa, donde es profesora e investigadora. Ella tiene una larga carrera tratando sobre estos temas, sobre imaginarios del fascismo proyectados y sobre todo la contrarrevolución en el régimen de la dictadura portuguesa. Y entre otras publicaciones, por ejemplo, en la Intellectual History Review de 2020, su texto Italian Fascism and the Portuguese Estado Novo es una de esas incursiones, ¿no?, de esas aportaciones. Y luego también un libro que ha editado en Routledge con Valeria Gallini, Intellectuals in the Latin Space During Fascism, es otra de esas demostraciones, ¿no?, de sus líneas de investigación. Y también me ha comentado ahora una exposición, me has dicho, ¿verdad?
En el Padrado de Descubrimientos.
Sobre los descubrimientos, en esa proyección, ¿no?, de las imágenes de los regímenes autoritarios, ¿no?, a través de esas lecturas. En segundo lugar, va a intervenir Gabriela de Lima, que es profesora en la Universidad Complutense, en el Departamento de Historia Moderna y Contemporánea, en la Facultad de Geografía e Historia. Ella es una experta, ¿no?, en el análisis de la proyección del fascismo en sus manifestaciones culturales, muy especialmente en su recorrido en Brasil y en España, y especialmente en esa dimensión comparativa. Y creo que, bueno, pues todos conocemos una de sus últimas publicaciones, un libro bastante ambicioso que ha publicado, editado con Leandro Pereira González, perdón, en Alianza en el año 22, Fascismos Iberoamericanos, ¿no?, que supongo que también aparecerá, pero es un libro más que recomendable. Y en tercer lugar interviene Marcela García Sebastiani, profesora titular de la Facultad de Ciencias Políticas de la Universidad Complutense de Madrid, también experta en estas ideas de las imágenes, mucho más allá solamente de su lectura fascista o autoritaria, con una atención muy atenta, ¿no?, valga la redundancia, muy cuidada a la imagen del hispanoamericanismo, de España, de la hispanidad, de ida y vuelta, ¿no?, tanto de España como del continente americano. Y bueno, pues yo había apuntado aquí, entre otras muchas obras, pero ese libro, ¿no?, el 12 de octubre, 100 años de hispanoamericanismo e identidades transnacionales, ese libro del año 21, editado por la Universidad Complutense. Este es el orden previsto. Saben los ponentes que tienen 15 minutos. Seré absolutamente rígido con el tiempo y con la flexibilidad que nos caracteriza, pero 15 minutos y después así damos tiempo al debate, a las cuestiones. Hasta las 2 tenemos. Muchas gracias. Ana Rita.
¿Funciona? Sí.
Sí.
Okay. I'm so sorry because my Spanish is basically in existence, so I speak in English, because otherwise it could be in Itas Portuñol. It was quite weird.
Sí.
I would like to say thank you to the organizer of this Congress. It's a real pleasure to see many friends today after the COVID break. So it's quite really pleasure to be here and to be in a mesa with all women. That is kind of impressive. I'm very glad about it. So let's talk about Portugal. Just give you a little brief contextualization. On 28th of May 1926, a coup d'etat that later was named National Revolution, Revolução Nacional, overthrew the first Portuguese Republic established in 1910. The military apparatus was not led by any political party or movements, and it developed as a traditional military pronunciamento rather than a concrete revolution, without any ideological purposes, not clear political goals. The immediate result was the establishment of an unstable military dictatorship, and it was only in 1933, with the approbation of the Portuguese constitution, that formally established the political regime called Estado Novo. led by Antonio de Oliveira Salazar until 1968. The regime consolidation process was therefore not a linear realization of a model previously defined by Salazar, but a matter of negotiation between the various tendencies that compose the Estado Novo itself: conservative Catholics, admirers of fascism, integralist monarchies, nationalists, part of the military commands, and even some reactionary Republicans. This paper does not focus the coup itself. It doesn't question it if it was a revolution or a counter-revolution. I will use the term national revolution because it was the term that was chosen at that time. But it explores how the Estado Novo sought to turn the 1926 revolt into a founding myth and an agglutinative myth to the regime. The analysis of the public use of this myth and its representation in 1934 documentary exhibition that was organized in Lisbon will allow us to underline some aspects. The first one is the introduction of some narrative topoi that would be at the basis of the following construction of the regime's political identity. The second was the contamination and hybridization that we already talked this morning with other kind of dictatorships, not only in Italy, but also in Russia. And the third is the friction between those I will call the memory keepers and those I will call the memory creators that mirrored the consolidation process of the early Estado Novo. As we know from the pioneeristic works of Mono Zuf, the praise of revolution of a constitutive act of the new political courses was not new. It was not invented by fascists or even in the interwar period, but it was in the interwar period that this memory policies climaxed. The new propaganda system, the importance of the masses in the political sense, and more simply, the two great political revolutions that were to shake up the 20th century, the Bolshevik one and the fascist one, turned the revolutionary celebration to a public show in which population in both role of spectator and participant were involved. Both Bolshevik and fascist model became points of reference and provided some elements that was later adopted and hybridized in other national contexts. The politically oriented storytelling, the portrait of revolution as a remedy against the distortion of the demo-liberal system, the symbolic appropriation of parts of public space. Besides these affinities, the fascist public use of revolution distinctly, of course, diverged from the Russian one, as instead of finding its rhetoric in the economic class dynamic, it relied upon a nationalistic ideological substrate and on a different attitude toward national history. The idea of conservative revolution rooted into a nationalistic substratum as a subversive act so to give an alternative to Bolshevik revolution in phasing to perceiving crisis in society has a strong impact in Portugal too, and in Portuguese intellectual, as for instance. Julia talked about books about fascist revolution. There was a very interesting book written by Homem Cristofiglio called Mussolini Battister dell'Avvenir. Another historian, another Portuguese historian, a very well-known historian, one of the main ideologists of the new state, the historian João Ameal, for instance, urged in his book A Revolução da Ordem, The Revolution of Order, that Portugal, and I quote, should have looked carefully at Rome if we wanted to save itself from Moscow. So fascinations are evident. Nevertheless, the study of political use of revolution made Salazarism reveal some peculiarities that are particularly interesting within the context of the literature on staging the national rebirth. Like other right-wing dictatorship, also the new state represented the 1926 March on Rome as the forerunner of an organicistic third way that had saved the nation both from the weakness of the prior liberal system and also to the turmoil associated with socialism. As the origin of the yearning for political and moral regeneration that encompassed private and public life. In this vein, the coup's narrative was frequently built around a simple contradiction between order and chaos, as we can see here in these propaganda posters related to the 1934 election. However, and in this very theatrical experiment that was organized in 1936 when Lisbon was bombarded for fake. It was an inscenation. It was a kind of experience like Orson Welles would have done 4 years after, and people read in the newspaper that Lisbon was actually bombed, and discovered just in the second page that it was not true. And we have to understand that here in 1936, just a few weeks before the start of the Spanish War. So this idea that Salazar and the Stato Novo keep the state in order, in a safe place. However, this new order brought back by the revolution did not seek to radically transform the society, as the Italian fascism claimed, but wanted to restore the orderliness and the greatness of the past. Similarly, because of the natural and political development of the 1926 coup, the new state's public views of revolution was neither interested in celebrating the palingenesis, imaginary associated with the revolution, as had been the case in the other contexts, so much to the narrative about the achievement of 28 might register almost a discursive oxymoron, whereby the idea of regeneration coincides with the death of restoration. The only revolution capable of restoring the order, quoting Amial again, and I quote, is that one was that knowledge of the past. More than a revolution in order to introduce radical changes, the Portuguese coup was thus portrayed as a beginning of the revolution of our order, the only one suitable for the national temperament and necessities. As Antonio Ferro explained in a 1934 speech, and I quote, the national revolution is the corporate state, the miracle of balanced budget, the roads without holes, and an efficient fleet, public works, and a new constitution. Salazar, Ferro continued, represent the emblem of this kind of revolution, and for those who have complained about this apparent as coldness and want someone more theatrical or someone more revolution in the external sense, I replied that he himself had made this mistake, that I made this mistake, and at the beginning because I did not understand that Salazar is the revolution. He is not a disciple but a master. This vision also encompassed the idea that the new citizen, that this is the revolution, have to bring to Portugal. The new man propagandized by the new state differed in so many aspects from the masculine and warrior's prototype strongly proposed in the right-wing ideologies at that time. Being molded upon the virtues embodied by Salazar, he was merely conceived as an ordinary devout father of family linked to the three pillars of the Stato Novo, God, fatherland, and family. Paraphrasing two well-known books belonging to the literature of fascism, it can therefore be said that the nature of Salazarism made Portuguese revolution more suitable to be defined a fight for restoration instead of struggle for modernity. In sum, the idea of restoring a national order is a strong peculiarity of the Stato Novo public use of national revolution, while, for instance, in the Italian fascist narrative about the March on Rome did not contain any nostalgia for a lost paradise to be reconstructed, the Portuguese one was deeply rooted in the Saudade. Concluding this part, as Salazar many times stated, the national revolution could not just reduce to a baroque conspiracy or to a simple substitution of government, but he has to consider instead as the first act in a wider battle for economic, financial, political, and moral order, whose highest aim was the reestablishment of an orderly, and I quote Salazar, national and authoritarian state, at that which Portugal experienced during the glorious periods of its foundation and maritime expansion. However, Salazar's rejection has to come to terms with the role of the army in this specific period of the early Stato Novo, which led to the dichotomy between memory makers and memory keepers. From the point of view of the public use of history, the implicit moral mission of such a restoration, on the one hand, contributed to build the narrative of the 28th of May as a national revolution rather than a simple Praetorian intervention. On the other hand, give rise to a pliant myth that would have been exploited during the formation and consolidation of the new state by many protagonists of such period in order to legitimize their presence at the top of the power. If we look at the celebration of a national revolution in the early years of Stato Novo, the 1934 celebration offers a good case in this sense. In this occasion, a documentary exhibition on the dictatorship achievement was organized. The model was quite similar to the Mostra della Rivoluzione Fascista held in Rome in 1932. A first part was designed as a storytelling to historically justify the regime. The narrative expedient of showing the transition from chaos to order through a chronicle was the same already used in Rome 2 years earlier. Also, in Lisbon, a series of events and protagonists of national history were carefully chosen and discarded in order to convert them into precursor or at least casual agent of the coup of 28th of May and the full instauration of Stato Novo. The first part was organized by Antonio Ferro, a journalist that was recently appointed as the director of the secretary of the propaganda. And as we can see, even if the narrative was very similar to the fascist revolution, the aesthetic was completely different. Even as we know that Ferro and his collaborator really well know the technique of the photo fresco and the photo collage and the photo montage that were used by Lisinski at the International Press Ausstellung in Cologne in 1929, and by Italian artists involved in the fascist revolution exhibition. We know that in this case in Lisbon, it just used a simple series of photo without any enlargement and whatsoever. A possible case of this is because this could be also interpreted as a kind of example of fracturation of the early stage of the Stato Novo. For instance, we have a very well done catalog of the second part of the exhibition realized by the União Nacional, the single party in Portugal, but we just have this very awful photo about the first part as a kind of forms of the national unit and military to kind of overshadow the personality of Ferro. The idea that the second reason is basically economic, because Portugal at that time, it was not so many money as Italy to realize a huge exhibition. As one of the commissionaries said, and I quote, "Let's starting by put the documentary exhibition in its rightful place. Those expecting something similar to the Italian exhibition will be disappointed. Our exhibition has to be on a scale 10 times smaller, but those who think there are no achievements within the 1926-1934 period also will have a surprise." In fact, the second part of the exhibition was dedicated to the achievement realized by Salazar since he joined the government. This part was organized in the main room, and in this case, graphics and diagram illustrated the government achievements in the main sector of the state intervention. Artists who worked in this part were some of the well-known Portuguese designers of their time. Many of them have a strong experience in the industrial exhibition and language of advertisement that infused to this kind of to this part of the exhibition. A second aesthetic reference they used was the isotype language, deeply used in foreign propaganda by the Soviet Union. And for instance, we know that some of the protagonists of this exhibition looked with a strong interest to the Russian propaganda, and noticed in their archives that, for instance, USSR in construction was sent to Portugal. So this circulation of imaginaries and technique was not encompass only the right-wing dictatorship and intellectuals. Why this kind of language was very interesting and very effective at that time? We can see here three examples. One is the exposition in Lisbon, the other one is the Mostra della Rivoluzione Fascista, and the third one is the Struggle of 5 Years in 4, a publication that the Soviet Union sent abroad. It's because when we talk about fascism, we have to understand that usually we talk about a very small level of people, a very small group of people in the high level of intellectuals network, but there are also the masses, and the masses are largely illiterated. So this kind of language was very clear, it was very immediate, and was very persuasive. And also as a strong idea that the scientific legitimacy, they are numbered, so they are true. So in conclusion, the multiplicity of narrative, historical and thematic, and styles, as well as the tripartition of committee among the army, the exponent of the single party, the União Nacional, and the Secretariato della Propaganda Nacional, was supposed to reflect the multifaceted nature of the protagonist of the national revolution. In this way, it was also intended to reconstruct and celebrate the various aspects of this founding myth. As a matter of fact, the 1934 exhibition told us a different story. And the committee's works ended up to reflect both the cleavages within the regimes and the feebleness of the national revolution's myth. On the one hand, the army claimed its leader role on the coup of the 28th of May and presented themselves as the legitimate custodians of the coup memory. On the other hand, although Salazar could not deny the military genealogy of his regime, was equally aware that he could not leave such monopoly in their hand. The public use of revolution, indeed, was born with a major vulnus at its base that could be not overcome. Unlike the Italian, Spanish, and Russian cases, the Portuguese coup did not immediately give birth to the regime and the Estado Novo, and the Estado Novo was actually just one of the possible outcomes of in a long and parades and exhibition that traced the model of fascist revolution celebration that Ferro had witnessed firsthand. As we know from his book, he was attending the first commemoration of March on Rome, as well as other Portuguese protagonists, such as the Portuguese ambassador at that time. The superimposition of Salazar images with the date of the 28th of May, as in the case of Braga's famous speech on the great certainties of the national revolution, the date did not become a key moment into the new civil calendar and ended up to be celebrating only sporadically. After the completion of the army reform between 1937 and 1939, which reduced the role of the military in public life and promoted the changes of leadership with the replacement of elements hostile to the regime, 28th of May passed almost unnoticed in the exhibitionary complex, or it was just sublimated by what happened after the 1933 Constitution proclamation. And it was other moments in the country's history more distant and more shared by the heterogeneous front supporting Salazar that were celebrated, like, for instance, the empire. Even the Union Nacional created precisely in Salazar words to replace was created in the Salazar words to replace the army after it had lost its revolutionary function of creating a non-partisan government, slowly lost momentum from 1937 onward, and was totally outclassed by the SPN in the identity creation of the regime. In the symbolic clash between the memory keepers and memory makers, the latter won.
Muchas gracias, Ana Rita.
I'm sorry, I have to rush a little bit, but I can stay here and talk about this topic for hours.
No, lo has transmitido. Bueno, me parece interesantísimo lo que has expuesto y seguro que ahora suscita muchas preguntas, cuestiones en el debate. Está servida las comparaciones. Creo que en la intervención previa sobre el caso italiano y la mirada al pasado había muchísimos elementos de comparación con el caso portugués. Bien, pues Gabriela, cuando quieras.
Hola, buenos días a todos y a todas. En primer lugar, muchas gracias por la invitación. Es un honor y una alegría estar aquí, ¿no?, compartiendo esta mesa con Marcela y Ana Rita. Y bueno, muchas gracias a los organizadores por la invitación. En mi presentación voy a hablar sobre la acción integralista brasileña, que es el movimiento fascista en Brasil. ¿Me escuchan bien? Sí. Y voy a intentar entonces traer un poco de las imágenes, ¿no?, de este fascismo extraeuropeo. Antes de hablar de fascismo en Brasil, es importante señalar que la era del fascismo no fue solo europea, sino que se mostró mucho más internacional y transnacional, penetrando en los discursos y en las prácticas de líderes carismáticos y movimientos políticos alrededor del planeta. No obstante, durante décadas, algunos historiadores, como Stanley Payne, en su obra El fascismo, han defendido la inexistencia del fenómeno fascista extraeuropeo. Para Payne, le cito, en América Latina no hubo sino unos pocos movimientos específicamente fascistizantes, tratándose de un fenómeno histórico limitado fundamentalmente a Europa durante la era de las dos guerras mundiales. Sin embargo, como ha argumentado Federico Fischenstein, es bastante curioso que los estudiosos de la historia europea se muestren dispuestos a estudiar circulación mundial del liberalismo y del marxismo pero cuando son confrontados con la participación europea con intercambios fascistas mundiales, prefieren invocar un abordaje más eurocéntrico. Por otra parte, diversos estudiosos del tema suelen justificar la inexistencia del fascismo extraeuropeo con base en el argumento de que solo en Europa el fascismo llegó al poder político. Al hacer esto, y como argumenta Benjamin Zakaria, se rechaza la idea de que el fascismo era una familia de ideas con orígenes, fundamentos intelectuales, estilos y organizaciones de movimientos comunes. En efecto, el propio Mussolini estaba convencido de que, en sus palabras, cada nación debería tener su propio fascismo adaptado a la peculiar situación del lugar y de su pueblo. Más recientemente, con el avance de los estudios comparados y transnacionales, bueno, ahora sí, como los de Constantin Iordache, que no sé muy bien cómo se pronuncia su apellido, Iordache, ¿no? Antonio Costa Pinto, que está aquí presente, y Federico Fischenstein, algunos de los nombres, ¿no? Así como de espacios de intercambio académico como la Asociación Internacional de Estudios Comparados del Fascismo, como el CONFAS. Algunos teóricos de la Academia Europea se han acercado al fascismo latinoamericano de forma más crítica. Un ejemplo de ello es Roger Griffin. Para el historiador británico, la era fascista significó geográficamente el surgimiento de modelos fascistas que fueron emulados, sea parcial, sea semióticamente. Y por otra parte, tuvo una dimensión imaginaria de creación de futuros ideales y de imaginarios utópicos, interiorizados y soñados por millones de personas o líderes políticos atraídos por el fascismo. De tal forma que no podemos más que rechazar la idea de la inexistencia del fascismo en América Latina. Los regímenes que sufrieron procesos de fascistización y que, por lo tanto, podemos caracterizar como regímenes fascistizados o parafascistas, deben ser incluidos en los estudios de la llamada era fascista, dado que los regímenes fascistas fueron modelos relevantes y resonaron en mayor o menor grado en las políticas desplegadas por los gobiernos nacionalistas y autoritarios de derechos del periodo. No cabe duda, por lo tanto, que esos regímenes deben estudiarse desde el grado de cercanía o lejanía con respecto al paradigma fascista. Existieron diferentes matices de la derecha, aquí llamé las 50 sombras de negro, dentro del marco conceptual general de una era fascista en la que existían membranas porosas entre diferentes manifestaciones de la política ultranacionalista antiliberal. Bueno, aquí haciendo un poco de publicidad del libro que publiqué con Leandro Pereira Gonçalves y que hay un prefacio de Roger Griffin y profesores como Antonio Costa Pinto participan, y ahí desarrollamos más sobre este tema. De esta manera, las derechas antiliberales exhibieron... a ver si yo ya he dicho eso. Vale. De esta manera, las derechas antiliberales exhibieron diferentes grados de radicalismo revolucionario y humanidad, diferentes intensidades de secularismo, racismo y fervor exterminador, todos los cuales estaban autorizados por la nueva moralidad y valores en la era fascista. En el caso de América Latina y específicamente de Brasil, los fascismos fueron movimientos sin régimen, es decir, no consiguieron tomar el poder. Y bueno, aquí son algunos de los movimientos fascistas en América Latina, y hoy el que voy a tratar es sobre Brasil, que es el que soy experta, vamos a decir así. Bueno, la acción integralista brasileña, si prestamos especial atención al fascismo en el contexto de los años 20 y 30, su surgimiento coincidió con una era general de autoritarismo político. Su aparición favoreció un proceso de radicalización de las derechas, cuya consecuencia fue el despliegue de una política nacionalista radical en otras partes del mundo. En esta misma dirección se inició un proceso de fascistización de determinados sectores de la derecha radical en Brasil, ¿no? Como es el caso de la acción integralista brasileña. Entonces, un año antes, por ejemplo, de la formación de la Falange española en Brasil, en octubre de 32, en la ciudad de São Paulo, se lança el Manifiesto de Octubre, presentado en el Teatro Municipal de São Paulo, y donde se funda entonces la Acción Integralista Brasileña, cuyo jefe supremo es Plínio Salgado. Es entonces el mayor movimiento fascista de América Latina y posiblemente el mayor movimiento fascista fuera de Europa. Y este movimiento logró un intenso y rápido crecimiento hasta la instalación de la dictadura de Getúlio Vargas, el Estado Novo, que fue instalado en noviembre de 37. Parecía ser que iba a haber una formación, una relación estrecha entre Vargas y Plínio Salgado, pero al final Vargas fue un poco más inteligente y le pareció que los fascistas estaban creciendo demasiado y era mejor entonces pues separarse de ellos y quitar un poco su poder, ¿no? Bueno, no voy a contar todo esto, pero bueno, entrando en los símbolos. El integralismo brasileño, entonces, a ver, no, aquí. Bueno, el movimiento integral, este es Plínio Salgado con su esposa en la otra foto, Carmela, ¿no? Y el movimiento integralista va a seguir de cerca los patrones del fascismo europeo en cuanto a la propaganda, organización, símbolos y actividades se refiere. El movimiento representó un estilo de vida en el cual los símbolos y rituales jugaron un papel central. Cito a Miguel Reale, que es uno de los principales ideólogos del movimiento. Si bien somos brasileños, nacionalistamente brasileños, al mismo tiempo presentamos valores que también se encuentran en los movimientos fascistas europeos, como los de Mussolini, Hitler y Salazar. Aquí interesante que él pone Salazar como un régimen fascista, ¿no? Como todos los movimientos fascistas, el integralismo brasileño era anticomunista. Aquí vemos entonces una imagen publicada en la revista de Anaue, que es la revista de los integralistas, ¿no? De Trotsky, ¿no? Como representando ahí el avance del comunismo y el miedo de este avance, ¿no? Y también el anticomunismo va a estar muy conectado también con el antisemitismo, de algunos ideólogos del movimiento, como Gustavo Barroso, que afirmaba que el comunismo y el capitalismo financiero eran creaciones del judaísmo. Y en la foto de la derecha sería, bueno, el indígena representado por Brasil, Brasil estaría representado por un indígena, la mano verde sería del integralismo, que está ahí salvando Brasil del asesinato, ¿no? Por parte del avance del comunismo. Asimismo, el integralismo va a adoptar como equivalente de la esvástica la letra griega sigma, que está a la derecha, símbolo matemático de la adición, la suma de infinitas partes, el saludo fascista con la exclamación indígena Anaue, que significa algo como unidos a los iguales. Van a utilizar la camisa verde, el lema Dios, Patria, Familia, el mismo que Salazar ha utilizado y otras diversas organizaciones fascistas y conservadoras. Van a organizar complejos rituales políticos de integración como asambleas y desfiles. El concepto de integrar estaba relacionado a esta visión total y orgánica del movimiento en el que participaban hombres, mujeres, niños y jóvenes. Su organización paramilitar buscaba reforzar los vínculos entre la comunidad integralista a través de espacios colectivos y rituales, como equipos de fútbol o bodas integralistas y una rígida jerarquía organizativa. Aquí un equipo de fútbol de la ciudad de Porto Alegre. En lo que se refiere a la asistencia social, el partido jugó un papel importante en la construcción, además de clínicas dentales, como podemos ver abajo, ¿no? La imagen, han construido varias escuelas, como la imagen a la derecha, clínicas médicas para ayudar a los necesitados, además de construir un servicio de restaurante popular y una especie de banco para otorgar préstamos a los miembros del movimiento, el préstamo Sigma. Aquí también objetos integralistas. Todo este culto pone de manifiesto la importancia de los elementos fascistas en el movimiento brasileño y su intento de renovación orgánica comunal, de moralidad corporativa, que trató de reforzar el sentimiento de pertenencia de algo y de solidaridad social. Sobre esse sentimento de pertenência, o historiador Griffin destaca que estes sujeitos se encontravam imersos em uma experiência revolucionária, que viviam ao filo da história, que com suas atuações estavam cambiando seu curso. E também, outro exemplo, em uma encuesta realizada pela revista Anaue, a las mulheres integralistas, se les perguntavam as motivações para unir-se ao movimento, e eles destacaram que o movimento les deu um novo sentido de vida. Las mujeres integralistas, ou las llamadas blusas verdes, desempenharam um papel importante na assistência social, pero não só em este âmbito. Como em todos os movimentos fascistas que surgiram no mundo, as blusas verdes, se bem jugaram um papel subordinado dentro do sistema integralista, foram muito importantes no desenvolvimento da organização, especialmente em la difusão da doutrina integralista com sua labor educativa e propagandística. Además de ter um papel importante na formação de niños em el partido, preparando a las generaciones futuras, es decir, futuros adultos integrales. Los llamados, tenían un nombre, plinianos. La integralista Nilsa Pérez destacó el papel de la mujer integralista en su condición de madre, esposa e hija. En sentido, el integralismo concibió las estructuras de género de manera jerárquica y como elemento central en su ideología y sistema organizativo. Si por un lado la feminidad integralista se construyó sobre la base principalmente de una idea de que el útero nacional y el papel de la educación residían en ellas, por otro lado, la masculinidad era vista como elemento más natural de la política fascista. Dentro de esa visión, los ideólogos integralistas buscaron crear un arquetipo masculino hegemónico, el llamado el hombre integral, una especie de hombre nuevo, ¿no? Y con él una nueva civilización capaz de derrocar el modelo liberal burgués de hombre. Espiritualismo. Es interesante resaltar que entre los integralistas no solo había cristianos. Antes de eso, la peculiar versión brasileña del fascismo se caracterizó por el fuerte peso de los elementos católicos. Aquí incluso vemos un cura, ¿no?, a la derecha, aunque sin la subordinación a un reaccionarismo religioso. Pero es interesante resaltar que entre los integralistas no solo había cristianos. El movimiento se abrió espacio para la regimentación de practicantes de diferentes denominaciones religiosas cristianas y también de espíritas al movimiento. Espiritismo es una religión muy importante en Brasil. Esto se debe a que su discurso se centró en el elemento espiritualista y no cristiano, claro que sí, cristiano, pero sobre todo espiritualista del movimiento, ya que el integralismo no admitía la exclusividad de una religión, al aceptar todas las religiones que adoran a Dios, aman la patria y respetan la familia, como fue destacado por un cura, el cura Meio, en 1935. Esta idea também foi destacada por um dos principais líderes integralistas, Miguel Reale, quando sostuvo que o movimento agrupava católicos, protestantes e espíritas, e, sin embargo, nenhum integralista com suficiente autoridade excluía tal ou qual crença. E, además, señalou que os integralistas defenderam um frente único espiritual. A dimensão étnico-racial. Também devemos ressaltar a dimensão étnico-racial da ideologia integralista. Para os camisas verdes, a sociedade brasileira se diferenciava em termos comparativos da europeia por sua composição multiétnica e multirracial. Precisamente foi fundamental a participação e inclusão de várias pessoas negras em las filas da ação integralista brasileira, aunque seus dirigentes eram menos numerosos. Entre quienes ocuparam cargos de relevância ou algum protagonismo se destacam Dário de Bittencourt, à la esquerda, João Cândido, seguindo, não? Mário Brasil de Araújo e, por último, Edith Gomes Soares de Pinho. En ese sentido, hay una diferencia muy evidente en cuanto a la idea de raza entre los distintos fascismos. Para los integralistas, algunos habían malinterpretado la doctrina moderna de las razas, ya que el pensamiento racista no se identificaba con el desprecio por otras razas, ¿no?, dicen ellos. Lo que argumentaban era que las naciones debían conservar y desarrollar las características específicas de sus propias razas. Y, por lo tanto, en el caso alemán, el mestizaje era rechazado cuando se consideraba perjudicial para ambas partes. La visión racista de la doctrina integralista proponía que la raza brasileña estaba compuesta por la integración de varias razas. Y Plínio Salgado, el jefe, a su vez, era el gran intérprete de la raza brasileña. El elemento indígena también fue sumamente importante. Este era considerado la base de la raza de todos los brasileños, siendo un elemento que estaba presente en símbolos y discursos integralistas, incluso desde una visión idealista. Los indígenas serían el pueblo más abierto al mestizaje, especialmente con los blancos, y culturalmente pacíficos. De acuerdo con un reportaje en la revista Naue, en 1935, había 5.000 integralistas indígenas de comunidades de Amazonas que habían sido catequizados y adoctrinados a través de las banderas. En ese sentido, Plínio Salgado, a través de la narrativa indígena, destacó el espíritu igualitario de la nación brasileña a través de la impresionante democracia racial existente, resultado de la fusión entre 3 grupos, indígenas, negros y blancos. Y ya para terminar, dentro de esta idea de construcción de una nueva civilización mestiza, los intelectuales integralistas desarrollaron una interpretación global de la historia de la humanidad, como en las obras A Quarta Humanidade y El Cuarto Imperio. Ellos asociaron el crecimiento de la acción integralista brasileña al surgimiento de una cuarta era de la humanidad, una variación de la triádica evolución histórica de los ideólogos fascistas del Tercer Reich y la Tercera Roma. Esta nueva era, la cuarta era, resurgiría en América. Representaba, por lo tanto, más que una realidad geográfica, un mito utópico. Los integralistas, por lo tanto, ubicaron el centro de la historia en América y no en Europa. Bueno, muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Gabriela. Creo que este ejemplo del fascismo brasileño aporta muchos, no solo anecdóticos, ¿no?, sino muchos elementos de análisis peculiares. Creo que esto del indigenismo es fascinante, la propia figura de Plínio Salgado y su origen. Pero bueno, vamos con Marcela. Sí, tienes que ponerte ahí. No, mejor ponte ahí, yo creo, porque así estás más cómoda. Dos minutos, sinceramente. Solo 2 minutos. No, está bien.
Soy un desastre con la tecnología, o sea que no sería una sorpresa. Pues, bueno, buenos días a todos. Muchas gracias por la invitación de los compañeros a este congreso. Yo no soy especialista en cuestiones sobre fascismo, nunca me gustó mucho estudiar pues, los regímenes dictatoriales, pero bueno, estudio una conmemoración a lo largo de la historia contemporánea que es el 12 de octubre y esa conmemoración atravesó por algunos momentos de contagio, difusión de ideas fascistas. Entre ellas, la celebración del 12 de octubre de 1940. El día 12 de octubre es una celebración, Día de la Raza, Día de la Hispanidad, actual Día Nacional de los Españoles, que recordaba al imperio, ¿no?, con rituales y referencias culturales múltiples que se había institucionalizado en 1918 y que el franquismo había reciclado y la había adaptado a las diferentes fases de la dictadura. Yo analizo los contextos, la internacionalidad de la celebración los espacios del despliegue, los actores implicados, las actividades complementarias que formaban parte del ritual público, además de las misas y los desfiles. Y entre esas actividades complementarias hay inauguraciones de obras públicas, hay pruebas deportivas de fútbol, natación, atletismo, golf, hay corridas de toros, hay congresos académicos y profesionales de todo tipo, hay certámenes de cine, de literatura, hay ferias de muestras y agrícolas, hay elección de reinas y también hay exposiciones. En el periodo de entreguerras y en la inmediata posguerra, en Madrid se celebraron varias exposiciones como actividad complementaria a la celebración del 12 de octubre en Madrid. De todas estas exposiciones, yo me voy a centrar en la de 1940, no porque la conozca más o la haya estudiado más, sino que es la exposición que claramente muestra el interés del régimen por ofrecer un espacio para una política de masas en torno a esta celebración. Todas las demás exposiciones fueron exposiciones concretas, con autoridades y casi concentrada en la diplomacia. Bien, pongo entonces atención en esta celebración, en esta exposición, perdón, en la de 1940, porque su puesta en escena fue representativa de cómo el franquismo utilizó la idea de imperio para consensos internos e internacionales. Como otras dictaduras del siglo XX, el franquismo, tras la guerra civil, utilizó el mito del imperio como propaganda política para aplacar las dificultades de la inmediata posguerra civil y unir al cuerpo nacional. También porque esta exposición está plagada de rituales y formas de expresión estética, cultural y pedagógica para una nación fascista, lo que permite pensar al fascismo en clave transnacional. De hecho, si seguimos a nuestra compañera y amiga Cira Vox, es la fiesta del año cero. Fue la primera exposición complementaria a la celebración del 12 de octubre que mostraba la tensión política de la inmediata posguerra y en medio de las negociaciones de intervención de España en la Segunda Guerra Mundial. Y además esa celebración y esa exposición se hizo días antes del encuentro entre Franco y Hitler en Hendaya. Esa fiesta del año cero tenía un claro interés de acabar con la fiesta protocolaria, con la fiesta fría de juegos florales, banquetes, de discursos académicos previos al franquismo. Esta fiesta y esta exposición del año cero desplegó de forma impresionante mitos y símbolos, materializó las energías de una política exterior agresiva y la añoranza de un imperio para relatos nacionalistas con contenidos de geografía e historia exhibidos en escenografías de cartón piedra en el espacio público. Esa exposición fue, a su vez, la escenificación del cortejo coyuntural entre Falange y el Partido Fascista Italiano. Paralela a esa exposición y a la celebración hubo actividades de todo tipo. Era un sábado. Actos populares, transmisiones de radio, actos académicos, congresos de expertos de urbanismo y vivienda, misas, procesiones, espectáculos taurinos, campeonatos deportivos. Para esa celebración y exposición del año 40 se quisieron encajar los componentes católicos del nacionalismo español como pedagogía de la nueva política. Por eso hubo procesiones de diferentes colectivos en la calle. Bien, esta exposición efímera, complementaria al ritual público, que se llamó La expansión española en el mundo y se celebró en el Parque de Retiro de Madrid, fue un instrumento para la identificación emocional e ideológica y de implicación a las masas. Fue un vehículo de comunicación sobre esa exposición, el franquismo, pero bueno, y el periódico Arriba, por Ramón Serrano. En la inauguración hubo uniformadas de falange estudiar la universalidad hispánica. Había estandartes con banderas del partido estatal, al igual que la Alemania y la Italia fascista. Había cornetas y tambores, inauguración con ritos de Arriba España, se cantó el himno de Cara al Sol, se hizo el saludo fascista y, por supuesto, la prensa del régimen estuvo en el evento de la inauguración. De hecho, pues el ritual de la inauguración ya mostró el interés por promocionar nuevas agendas políticas y culturales para el Día de la Raza. Esa celebración, esa exposición mostró también una clara confraternidad entre la España y la Italia fascista. De hecho, esa exposición está relacionada con viajes de organizaciones y departamentos gubernamentales en el periodo de entreguerras a la Italia fascista y a la Alemania nazi. De hecho, el propio Serrano Suñer había formado parte de esos viajes de intercambio. También, como similares esfuerzos por el gobierno de Mussolini, fue una exhibición didáctica para una amplia audiencia para relacionar al régimen con su pedigrí imperial. Esa confraternidad entre Italia y España se demostró días previos al trajín del Día de la Raza. De hecho, para el 10 de octubre de 1940 había visitado a España para condecorar a Franco un falangista italiano, Emilio Di Bono, un excombatiente de la Gran Guerra que se había unido a Benito Mussolini en la marcha de Roma y para formar el Partido Fascista Italiano. Pues el despliegue para recibir a este visitante italiano fue impresionante por Madrid, por Toledo, por Sevilla, por el Escorial, y hubo demostraciones modernas de todo tipo. En fin, incluso la visita de este señor sirvió para inaugurar la Cámara de Comercio italiana como augurio de futuros negocios y complemento del Instituto Cultural Italiano que se había establecido en Madrid meses antes. O sea, que ese 12 de octubre daba para mucho. Bien, algunas cuestiones sobre el recinto, sobre el contenido y algunas dos ideas para cerrar mi intervención. Vemos estas fotografías de periódicos alineados al régimen, nos permite tener una idea general sobre cómo fue el recinto. Un austero edificio de exhibición con reminiscencias a las construcciones de la Italia de Mussolini. Era un pabellón de 22 metros de largo por 14 de ancho, una estructura de líneas rectas pero grandilocuentes, hechas de cartón piedra, madera, yeso, y ornamentada con símbolos representativos del pasado glorioso del imperio. Centraba la exposición tras una hilera de banderas de naciones que habían formado el imperio español, Estaban reproducidas también las columnas de Hércules como símbolo del mundo ultramarino. Había escalinatas, había una explanada y como espacio concentrado de ostentación del poder se exhibía un globo terráqueo de 3 metros de diámetro, rodeado de agua, sobre una rosa de los vientos y con líneas que demarcaban las expediciones más importantes, la extensión del imperio y los límites para los descubrimientos entre los reinos de España y Portugal. Por fin, dentro del recinto, se montó una escenografía con objetos patrimoniales, mapas, documentos, reproducciones y explicaciones sobre viajes, monarcas, descubridores, eclesiásticos, escritores, contables, constructores, geógrafos y artistas, relacionados todos con el pasado imperial. Todo eso entre murales pintados con colores y vitrinas. La exposición fue toda una exhibición de mensajes simbólicos actualizados por el arte visual de posguerra, que hacían culto a una nación eterna, un imperio regenerado y la unidad desde Madrid. La exposición para el 12 de octubre en Madrid había transformado el espacio público en un instrumento cultural para el uso político y el ejercicio de liturgias únicas de comunión entre el poder y la sociedad para intensificar sentidos de identidad, cohesión y poder del nuevo Estado. Con un decorado único para seducir y despertar la imaginación, con tiempos míticos y atmósferas sagradas y aventureras, la exposición de yeso y maderas blandas representaba el renovado estilo vital, emprendedor, insuflado para una celebración que abandonaba las retóricas vacías del pasado, según decía. ¿Qué se expuso en esa exposición? Algunas fotos localizadas. 3 piezas fundamentales, 5 vitrinas y murales. Las 3 piezas fundamentales fueron la reproducción de la nave de Colón, la Santa María, una copia del retrato de Isabel la Católica, custodiado por el Palacio Real, y el mapa de Juan de la Cosa, que fue la primera representación conocida sobre América, que además se había hecho en el año 1500 y que conserva el Museo Naval. Esas fueron las 3 piezas fundamentales. En las 5 vitrinas custodiadas por las flechas se exhibían ejemplares de patrimonio documental con ingenuos carteles para el conocimiento sobre cronistas, reyes, geografía, arte, leyes y libros sobre América. Se expusieron cartas de Hernán Cortés y Juan Díaz de Solís, la recopilación de leyes de Indias, el decreto del Papa Alejandro, por el que se invitaba a los monarcas españoles a convertir a los nativos de los territorios descubiertos al catolicismo, la poesía de Sor Ángela de la Cruz y del Inca Garcilaso, la gramática de Antonio Nebrija, ejemplares de cartografía naval, mapas, planos de palacios e iglesias, todos procedentes de la a modo de documentos, instruían al espectador en conocimientos de geografía en dimensiones colosales para hacerlo partícipe de una experiencia de voluntad colectiva al visitante, poniendo el foco en la atmósfera de la escena pintada. Unos murales demarcaban las rutas de conquistadores, galeones y corsarios y lugares de descubrimiento y colonización. Otros localizaban el poder colonial en virreinatos, audiencias, capitanías, misiones religiosas y en la cultura universitaria. Por fin, los textos escritos y los eslogans en los murales decían cosas como: primero, el mundo aprendió a navegar en libros de España. Segundo, España alega su condición de eje espiritual del mundo hispánico, como título de preeminencia en las empresas mundiales. Todos estos murales tenían efectos pedagógicos y de adoctrinamiento ideológico. Servían para asentar la idea de imperio y sus símbolos para el consumo visual de audiencias concretas. Las artes plásticas en esta exposición se dispusieron para instrumentalizar la misma con fines políticos. Todos esos frescos de los murales estuvieron a cargo de Daniel Vázquez Díaz, el pintor de la Hispanidad, con una visión mítica del imperio. Tenía una pintura, según dicen sus críticos, que combinaba tendencias modernistas y tradicionales. Una pintura enérgica, con mucha sensibilidad al color y también a los hechos históricos. Conforme al contenido de la exposición, la misma intentó establecer un paralelo entre los esfuerzos que había hecho el reino, que habían hecho los reyes, la corona española en la época imperial con el nuevo régimen, con el fin de adoctrinar a todos los sectores de la sociedad para conquistar una audiencia. Finalmente, dos cuestiones y con esto acabo. Fue una exposición con sentido pedagógico y de adoctrinamiento. De hecho, con ánimos de despertar la imaginación de clases sociales con aspiraciones de movilidad social dentro del nuevo régimen, con la exposición se hicieron conferencias académicas públicas y también visitas de eruditos. Pero no solo eso, sino que se organizaron visitas para grupos de estudiantes, obreros, soldados, militantes, guardias civiles, familias, jóvenes falangistas, vecinos, hombres y mujeres. De hecho, la prensa del régimen exaltaba la curiosidad de los visitantes sencillos y cómo los objetos expuestos eran resultado del orgullo de ser españoles. Según la prensa falangista, la exposición despertaba la emoción de jóvenes que en el pabellón recibieron clases de nacionalsindicalismo, navegación, geografía, historia y captaron con claridad la idea de imperio y de genio español. De hecho, la escenografía expuesta creó un espacio visual y de práctica social que materializaba la idea falangista de nación española. Por fin, la dimensión transnacional de esta exposición. La idea de imperio, moldeada por los artistas para visualizar la identidad nacional, puso a los falangistas españoles en sintonía con los fascismos europeos, especialmente con Portugal y con Italia. Ambos estados y exposiciones, tanto de Portugal y de Italia, habían inspirado a los diseñadores de esta exposición de 1940. Como ya lo demostró Anarita en otros trabajos, el Estado Novo de Portugal en los años 30 había plasmado en más de una exposición el interés por mostrar la fortaleza de la expansión de Portugal en el mundo, exaltando pues el imperio colonial portugués. Y en el caso de Italia, también Mussolini había integrado los valores de la universalidad y eternidad del catolicismo en su modo de hacer política mediante escenarios, monumentos y espectáculos públicos. Y como ejemplo, la exposición inaugurada por él en 1937 como homenaje a los 2000 años del nacimiento del emperador Augusto. Para esa exposición de 1937, la antigua Roma se había puesto a disposición de la Roma del siglo XX y reconstrucciones arqueológicas, artísticas y de muros exaltaban el poder militar y la idea de inmortalidad de un imperio que introducían a los visitantes en un viaje histórico sobre la civilización italiana actualizada por la propaganda política fascista. En definitiva, esta exposición de 1940 es un ejemplo de la difusión del fascismo entre fronteras. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Marcela, por tu exposición. Bueno, hemos terminado con las intervenciones de las ponentes. Vamos a dar paso al debate. Hay, creo, muchísimas cuestiones que plantean conexiones entre las intervenciones y que también conectan con lo que se ha planteado en la intervención inicial. Bueno, sé que tenéis todos muchas preguntas, pero ya que tengo el micrófono, pues voy a lanzar yo las primeras, ¿no? A agarrarme al privilegio de estar en la mesa, y no me gustaría que las contestarais directamente, sino que si sirven un poco para plantear unos elementos. Y aquí recojo para empezar algo que ha manifestado Marcela al final de su intervención, ¿no? Esa coincidencia en los imaginarios de esos tres proyectos fascistas o contrarrevolucionarios, en una palabra mágica, en un proyecto que sería el del imperio, ¿no? Bueno, en el caso de Brasil, quizá no tan presente, pero me interesa mucho porque creo que va directamente a esa gran contradicción, ¿no?, entre esos elementos transnacionales y unas aspiraciones de engrandecimiento de la nación, en esa aspiración sin duda imperial, ¿no? ¿Cómo se casa eso, ¿no? Claro, tenemos dos imperios, en el caso portugués y español. Si sumamos el italiano ya tenemos tres. No chocarían esas, aunque se compartan las imágenes, no chocarían esas propuestas, ¿no? Me da la sensación de que ahí hay una gran contradicción de suyo que obviamente no descubro yo, ¿no? Otro de los elementos que ha aparecido aquí mucho es la hibridación de las imágenes, ¿no? Y creo que la exposición de Anarita estaba directamente explícito, sobre todo en el texto también, ¿no?, entre los fascismos y los movimientos conservadores. Me gustaría que también plantearais, y en el caso de tanto de Marcela como de Gabriela, ahí ya estaba el elemento católico, que estaba de suyo también por ahí flotando, ¿no? Otro de los aspectos que a mí me ha gustado mucho que ha aparecido es el concepto de la revolución del orden, que sería también otro concepto, otra imagen, si queremos, porque de hecho salía, ¿no?, en alguno de esos carteles que pone otra vez sobre la mesa esta complejidad, ¿no?, de estos regímenes fascistas que en su proyección visual o imaginaria pues tienen que navegar, ¿no?, en una especie de equilibrio entre la mirada al pasado, que da la sensación que plantea esa revolución del orden, y esos creadores, ¿no?, de imágenes que decía Anarita. Y por último, la otra, bueno, tenía más cosas y las he compartido con las ponentes, pero esto del espiritualismo católico a mí, Gabriela, me ha fascinado, ¿no?, esa especie de gran amalgama compleja. Bueno, lo del indigenismo también me parece muy original, muy singular en el fascismo brasileño, pero este papel distinto, creo, de la religión, una especie de otra hibridación, otra mezcla, creo que también es como imagen, muy sugerente, muy relevante en el caso brasileño, esa peculiaridad. Bueno, yo dejo esto aquí y ahora sí que abrimos el turno de preguntas. Si queréis recogemos, por ejemplo, 3 y si luego queréis responder a lo que yo os he planteado, estupendo, y si no, ahí quedan las cuestiones. Manuel tiene una. Manuel,
si no hay nadie, aprovecho el hecho que ya tengo el micrófono. Tengo dos, porque hay un elemento que me ha gustado muchísimo. Bueno, me han gustado en general las tres exposiciones, muy interesantes, pero hay un elemento que me interesa mucho, y es un poco, tiene que ver un poco, hemos hablado mucho de difusión al interior de redes transnacionales, de movimientos de la extrema derecha en este periodo, pero hay dos elementos en la presentación de Anarita, de Gabriela, que creo que interesa un poco cómo elementos han podido difundirse también entre extremos diferentes, extremo de la izquierda puede ser, o elementos conectados con la política social, por ejemplo. Entonces, la primera pregunta sería para Gabriela, porque has hablado un poco de la política social del movimiento integrador en Brasil, y me preguntaba, Marc Mazaura ha escrito bastante sobre el rol de la política social en los movimientos fascistas, en particular el movimiento nazi. Ha hablado de Estado social racial, y bueno, en Brasil tenemos una situación completamente diferente con esta, me parece entender, no lo conozco para nada, de esta concepción racial multirracial. Y me preguntaba si hay elementos de este Estado social racial, entonces excluyente, que se pueden ver también en la política social en Brasil, aunque la ideología parece ser una ideología bastante integradora, o si hay elementos que podemos ver, hay una comunicación entre estos dos, entre este modelo de Estado racial, social racial en Brasil también. Y a Narita, io ho una domanda riguardo alla propaganda, diciamo, del regime di Salazar, che prende elementi di spunto, se ho capito bene, dalla propaganda dell'Unione Sovietica. E volevo chiederti se potevi elaborare un po' di più su questo tema, quali sono precisamente questi elementi, se c'è una percezione anche di una contraddizione, nel senso se li utilizzano però al tempo stesso non vogliono che sia troppo visibile, se c'è un dilemma da questo punto di vista negli attori del regime che utilizzano questi schemi. Grazie.
Gracias. Sí, en cierto modo creo que los tres papers vienen un poco a confirmar lo que habíamos visto esta mañana de la importancia, digamos, de lo nacional en la transmisión de ideas transnacionales, ¿no? Como el marco que genera, al fin y al cabo, es el que por el cual se interpretan casi todo. Tenía una pregunta que estaba vinculada también con la cuestión de los imperios, y era para Gabriela en particular. Era fundamentalmente cuál es el papel que juega la idea de imperio en Brasil en el movimiento fascista brasileño. Porque Brasil, bueno, pues también fue un imperio, ¿no? Entonces no sé si los Pedros o Pedro II en particular tiene algo, es una figura histórica que se recoge o realmente la cuestión imperial está fuera del fascismo brasileño.
Si queréis responder estas cuestiones ya, y luego si surgen más, estupendo.
¿Comienzo? ¿Sí? Pues no voy a contestar todas, pero sí voy a contestar a algunas de las reflexiones que me motivan a su vez otras reflexiones. Aquello que decía Pepe sobre las contradicciones del imperio y que ahora recoge un poco Alejandro. Yo creo que el imperio es una idea, es un mito que permite el establecimiento de conexiones, que permite hacer una historia transnacional y por ende evitar eso que tú has llamado las contradicciones. Porque si te fijas, y aquí pues también respondo otra pregunta, yo pienso que el componente católico tiene perspectiva y puede ser analizado en clave transnacional. Cuando uno piensa en términos transnacionales y en ideas que puedan ayudar a conformar una estructura transnacional, piensa en la tensión entre lo nacional y lo internacional, en primer lugar. Y en segundo lugar, cuando uno piensa en estas cuestiones, también piensa en los márgenes, los bordes de los estados nacionales. Y la idea de imperio pues ayuda, ¿no?, a que estados nacionales con un pasado de imperio puedan tener una idea, un mito para establecer conexiones, para establecer transferencias, para hacer circular ideas, para hacer circular imágenes. Y hablar en estos términos nos ayuda a pensar en una de las palabras que repetimos mucho los historiadores y que yo creo que no sirven para nada. Uno es la influencia y otro es importante, ¿no? Todo influye y todo es importante. O sea, si uno piensa en estos términos, pues claro, si piensa en la circulación de ideas, de imágenes, si piensa en los actores, en quién recibe, pues se acaba aquello tan ambiguo, de tanta ambigüedad como la influencia y la importancia, ¿no? Porque le ponemos a todo nombres y apellido. Y la segunda cuestión, tú contabas sobre las imágenes. Pues claro, a mí me sorprende mucho esto del fascismo, y no quiero que me sorprenda mucho, ¿no? Porque a ver si de repente pues, me gusta también el fascismo. Pero sí me llama mucho la atención esto de las líneas geométricas, la simplicidad, el color, ¿no? O sea, este señor que pintó estos muros que yo he hecho referencia, había pintado los muros de la Rábida, por invitación de Alfonso XIII para la fiesta del 12 de octubre de 1928. Y claro, y vi unas imágenes, y claro, y aquí son colores muy exultantes, ¿no? Con unas figuras geométricas muy cercanas. ¿No? Pero además de la fuerza de esas imágenes, de la fuerza artística de esas imágenes, interesa también cómo se lleva a la gente a que vea todo eso, ¿no? Esa organización de rutas, de visitas, ¿no? Ayuda a que se vea aquello que es nuevo, colorido, exultante. Y no puedo decir más nada de las preguntas que has formulado.
Muy bien, excelente.
Sí, yo, bye. Sí. Hola, no sé si están.
Hacia arriba, ahí.
Vale. Bueno, voy a intentar contestar todo porque son muchas cuestiones. Bueno, un poco como introducción, ¿no? Yo creo que hay un término que utilizamos Leandro y yo en la introducción del libro Fascismo Iberoamericano sobre el fascismo, que es que el fascismo es un fenómeno global, ¿no? O sea, que es a la vez local y global, ¿no? Eso yo creo que ha quedado bastante claro en todas las presentaciones, sobre todo, cuando vemos el caso de Brasil, ¿no? Obviamente que hay siempre el referente principal es Italia, ¿no? La Italia fascista, pero siempre teniendo en cuenta las particularidades del caso brasileño, ¿no? de la historia y de la cultura brasileña, ¿no? Y, a ver, en esta pregunta también se había planteado la cuestión del imperio, y ya conectando un poco con lo que el profesor Alejandro también había preguntado, ¿no? Yo no creo que en Brasil no se trate el tema del imperio, yo creo que sí. Primero que hay dos obras escritas por los dos principales teóricos. Entonces es un mito utópico, ¿no? Es un imperio utópico, ¿no? Del futuro, ¿no? Brasil también es presentado como un lugar sagrado, un lugar también de alguna manera utópica en el que todas las razas confluían. Entonces ellos utilizaron también la cuestión racial para crear este mito y mostrar cómo aquí en esta tierra va a ser el futuro, ¿no? Entonces el futuro no está en Europa, Europa ya es pasado, Brasil es el futuro. Y Dom Pedro de alguna manera sí que tiene importancia, porque Dom Pedro es visto como, al final el imperio brasileño, ¿no? El Brasil no se ha fragmentado como las otras repúblicas hispanoamericanas, ¿no? Y tenemos este territorio pues unificado. Entonces esta idea de imperio, de la monarquía portuguesa juega un papel importante también en el imaginario, no solo para el movimiento fascista brasileño, pero también para Vargas. Vargas habló algunas veces
sobre la importancia, ¿no?, de Don Pedro, etcétera, para la integración nacional. Y también él hacía eso como también una crítica al sistema liberal, porque de alguna manera se estaba fragmentando, ¿no? El liberalismo fragmentó de alguna manera pues las identidades brasileñas, ¿no? Bueno, el rol de la política social, ¿no?, del integralismo, obviamente que yo creo que, bueno, en España también, en todo, yo creo que en general los movimientos fascistas se importaron mucho con lo social, ¿no? En el caso de Brasil, obviamente que es muy importante, sobre todo en un país con tantas desigualdades. No sé si puedo desarrollar más sobre las políticas sociales, pero como han visto, han construido escuelas, que incluso hay una escuela que se llama Escuela Plinio Salgado, hasta hoy lleva este nombre, construyendo varias escuelas, ¿no? De alguna manera es una forma de integración de la sociedad y entra dentro de esta idea de formar parte de una comunidad, ¿no? Las escuelas, los restaurantes populares para atender a la gente humilde, y ahí también, claro que dentro de la gente más necesitada, obviamente que está la cuestión de las personas afro-brasileñas, entonces también importante para ellos que de alguna manera integrar a este proyecto que dice que ellos forman parte, ¿no? Luego las mujeres también se sienten muy parte de esto, ¿no? Eso es importante, ¿no? Parte de un proyecto mayor, ¿no? Entonces tienen un poder público, ¿no? Pero, por otra parte, lo que quería mostrar de la cuestión étnico-racial no es que los integralistas no son racistas, es una otra idea racista, al revés del racismo nazi, que es excluyente. Este es incluyente, pero incluyente en el sentido de que esta sería como una raza superior también, ¿no? Como decir así. Y además ven a los indígenas como, bueno, desde esa perspectiva colonialista de que dice que los indígenas son como más abiertos a la integración, pero es que vivieron un proceso de violencia, que no son críticos, ¿no?, de la colonización, que las mujeres fueron abusadas y por eso que hubo ese blanqueamiento de la población. No es que los indígenas son más abiertos, ¿no? Y también hay una mirada muy paternalista hacia los indígenas. Hay hay una política evangelizadora, porque también son los curas integralistas que van hacia el interior, ¿no?, a más bien evangelizarlos que otra cosa, ¿no? No sé. Y no sé, o sea, un montón de cosas, no quiero... bueno, hay un montón de cosas, luego seguimos. Sí,
Okay. Okay, transnationalism and nationalism. We can stay here for weeks, I think, to talk about it. And to be very quick and very simplified a lot, I think that we can see some transnational interconnection when we talk about practice, when we talk about aesthetic, when we talk about representation, when we talk about the diffusion of some parts of ideologies, but then we have also to take into account the hybridization, above all, the recontextualization in the national context. I think this is the interesting tension about nationalism and transnationalism. For instance, the project of Kaur, export abroad, the fascism, it doesn't work at least. And if we look at the exhibitions organized at the end of the 1930s, and I was thinking about when Marcela speaking, as she said, there was organized 3 major exhibitions at the end of the 1930s. The first one was organized in Rome in 1937, the Mostra Augusta della Romanità, and then in Portugal, the Exposição do Mundo Português, that was very linked to a concept called Portugalidade, and then the Exposición de la Expansión Española del Mundo. If we briefly compare these 3 events, I think that we can see a difference respect to what happened at the beginning of the decade. That means that each of these countries closed itself, protect itself in a kind of hyper-nationalism. Romanità, Portuguesidade, and Hispanidad. also in response of what happened in the world. In the case of Italian-Portuguese relationship, this was a lot to see about the Ethiopian War and then the deflagration of the World War II. But I have a question. May I pose a question to the audience, because I'm not an expert of Francoism. I just studied this exhibition because it was linked to my exhibition. But I have a question for you that studied this topic for a long time. In the case of Portugal, in the case of Italy, both regimes celebrated an empire that was actually on stage. You know, for Mussolini was fundamental, was crucial to justify the Ethiopian War, present itself as the man who bring back the empire to the Colli Fatali di Roma, the new Augustus, blah blah blah. And for Salazar, it was crucial too, because he was very aware that his empire was threatened by the Italians in the Africa, and then at the beginning of the World War II, he knew that maintaining an empire was quite complicated with a world war in act. But why Spanish celebrated a thing that actually don't have? So it was quite I don't know. I was thinking about it because I never reflect about it and say, okay, why they use an empire that are no longer control? It was kind of fascinating for me, this and I would like to know more about it.
Creo que Cira tenía una pregunta, igual Cira también puede responder.
Creo que Cira quiere contestar.
Bueno, gracias. Me alegra que plantees la pregunta, Ana Rita, porque era una pregunta que yo quería también plantearle a Marcela. Tienes razón en lo que dices, pero creo que el franquismo, justo además, en este momento que está estudiando Marcela, sobre todo el año de 1940, coexisten las dos ideas de imperio. Lo que ocurre que el imperio pasado, la hispanidad, el imperio como historia, el imperio como un mito que legitima el presente, pero que no tiene ningún viso de realización ni ninguna ambición expansionista, triunfa muy pronto. Pero en el año 40 y en el año 39, pero sobre todo en el 40, creo que es posible ver que en el franquismo sí que hay una revitalización de las ideas expansionistas que se están jugando en ese momento y que quizá puedan ser similares a lo que ocurre en Italia y Portugal. Yo creo que en España se ve muy claro que la idea de imperio es diferente entre las dos grandes culturas políticas. Lo que pasa es que triunfa fundamentalmente la de la hispanidad, que es el imperio retórico. El imperio que funciona como mito es el imperio pasado, y el pasado es legitimación del presente, pero basado en el pasado, es un uso de la historia. Pero en el año 40, que es un poco la pregunta que yo quería hacerle a Marcela, sobre todo, la verdad es que no conocía esta exposición, no la había estudiado y es una mina impresionante, la has contado muy bien. Dura 15 días, nos has dicho. Y has dicho además que los fondos venían del Ministerio de la Gobernación y del Ministerio de Asuntos Exteriores. Me bailan las fechas, pero Serrano Súñer en este momento está pasando de un ministerio a otro. No recuerdo si ya ha llegado a Asuntos Exteriores, de Gobernación, o está a punto de llegar. Y si ha habido alguien en España y en el franquismo con ambiciones imperialistas de verdad, germanófilo, fascista convencido, Serrano Súñer. Con lo cual, un poco la pregunta era, tú nos has contado sobre todo la parte más pedagógica y educativa. En estas conferencias quizá más un mito, sino que es una realidad porque hay ambiciones expansionistas de verdad. Bueno, era un poco si habías encontrado esto.
Pues…
Una última de Javier y yo creo que ya cerramos con esta.
Bueno, por responder a esta pregunta, que es muy interesante, el imperio ultramarino español desaparecido tiene que ver también con la mitología portuguesa, en el sentido de que se parece a la reivindicación de los navegantes portugueses del pasado, ¿no? Pero creo que se puede establecer un nexo en estos años entre la reivindicación del imperio del pasado con Marruecos y África en el presente, que es lo que le pide Franco a Hitler en Hendaya. Exactamente, ¿no? O sea, que le deje Marruecos, ¿no? Y eso los militares y los políticos del momento lo tienen claro. Reivindicando la grandeza de España en el pasado, también se se está pidiendo un papel geopolítico de la España de entonces, ¿no?
Reivindicaciones de España,
Sí,
de Fernando María Castilla y Areilza, que luego unos años después iban a estar recibiendo en Madrid Eisenhower y que hacen este libro Reivindicaciones de España, y son España tiene derecho pues a recuperar sus territorios africanos, etc. Bueno.
Sí.
Perdón, no, que decía que junto a las peticiones de Franco a Hitler hay también toda la corriente del falangismo en esos 39, 40, 41, por lo menos mientras a los alemanes les va bien la guerra, tienen unas reivindicaciones que son reales, que es, como decía Javier, el norte de África o, de un modo más concreto, el África francesa. Y es parte del ideario falangista, esa reivindicación de imperio, que no es un imperio de papel, sino que es un imperio que se proyecta. Otra cosa es que a Hitler no le pareciera buena idea. Pero ya.
Marcela, si quieres contestar a
sí,
Cira.
en esta pregunta concreta que me hace Cira, ¿no? Pues sí, seguramente recuerdas esta conmemoración porque yo leí páginas tuyas sobre esta exposición, o sea, que la tienes que seguramente la recuerdas en tu libro. Sí. Pero sobre lo que me preguntas de los discursos, mira, sé que hay conferencias académicas, pero solamente leí en la prensa los discursos de la inauguración. No vi los discursos académicos. Puede que hay un montón de cosas que todavía no vi de esta exposición, que la tengo ahí pendiente. Pero me llamó mucho la atención entre los discursos de la inauguración los de los diplomáticos latinoamericanos, ¿no? Los diplomáticos latinoamericanos, amigos del franquismo. Y entre ellos el de un diplomático peruano, no me acuerdo el nombre, pero que reivindica esta idea de imperio español, esta idea de España como conductora de una universalidad hispánica dirigida hacia los países de América Latina y que han sido colonias.
Marita, ¿quieres decir algo?
Sí. I just want to reply very quickly to Emmanuel about Russian aesthetic. Well, when I started to study the aesthetic representation of Portuguese regime, okay, it was quite obvious the link with the Italian, and then I don't discover nothing. I find a mail exchange between two of the main protagonists of the propaganda. One was Letao de Barros, that was an artist, journalist, and photographer, and the other one was Antonio Ferro. And Letao de Barros actually studied in Berlin. He studied the fotorotogravatura. It was a technique that allowed to combine many images, many photographs. And he said to Ferro, we have to think our propaganda differently. We have to produce something, and I said in Portuguese, temos que fazer algo sobre o luxo, uma publicação à maneira dos italianos e dos russos. And after that, I exchanged some ideas with some colleagues that are designers, and they explained me that in Berlin at that time, a lot of Russian propaganda, Russia journals and magazines arrived and was studied in the school. So it was clearly that idea in mind. And then after that, I also discovered that some of the Russian publications were sent to Portugal, not to the government, of course, because they're different schools, different ideologies, but was sent to the industrial people, because Russia wants to enlarge its market. So it arrived through the commercial ways, not the propaganda. And you know, in propaganda, you have to be very pragmatic. So if something works, works. And then you can adjust to your ideology. And Russians are really good to propaganda, indeed. And especially in this first year when they looked at the way to vehiculate and represent the idea of revolution, Italy and Russia are the two masterpieces where they look at. But of course, they are strongly anti-communist, blah, 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 and they assume that just in the private correspondence.
Muy bien. Pues muchísimas gracias, Marcela, Ana Rita y Gabriela, por vuestras intervenciones. Gracias a todo el público por las preguntas y el debate. Vamos a continuar a las 4. Sean conscientes de esta hora a la hora de pedir sus menús respectivos, por favor. Pero será también una sesión de tarde muy interesante y muy sugerente. Muchas gracias.
Grazie a te.